Our clock on the wall is a little fast. I've got 5 o'clock exactly on my iPhone here, so I'd like to gab us in to start the meeting at, we'll do it 5:02 off the clock on the wall. And we'll have our roll call. Trustee Capel?
Here.
Trustee Clark?
Here.
Trustee Andrews here. Trustee Khan?
Here.
And Trustee McMullen is not here. The second item of business is the approval and reordering of agenda items. And I do have a request to move one item, the report for the Altadena Library Foundation and also Friends of the Library, a little farther up, a little closer to the beginning of the agenda. So I would propose that we place their reports after item 3, unfinished business, which will be a presentation on Brown Act policies. Are there any other recommendations for reordering the agenda? That's a no. Okay. So could I get a motion then on reordering the agenda with item 2, make sure we've got this right. Item 7C to reports to be moved up to after item 3, unfinished business.
Also moved. Oh, second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to do that change. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that motion carries. The next thing is the adoption of the agenda. And do we have a motion now to discussion number 1, the adoption of the agenda? Okay, how about a motion then to approve that?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, and again, all in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Okay. So the next thing is public comment on non-agenda items, number 2D. I know we've got a speaker or two that would like to talk about that. Renee, Amy.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Just real quickly, because you've got a lot to do tonight, I just wanted to point out to members of the board that, as you know, you are the only local elected legislative body in Altadena. And as such, you, the board members, model for the community, for the library patrons, for the community, for local taxpayers, for library patrons and library staff, what efficiency and efficacy looks like. So, when you come to the board meetings and you're not prepared, you model how this library district should be expected to be run. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Whether or not you come prepared models the expectation of you people for how this library will be run. What that means is, if you want the community, the taxpayers, the users of the library, the patrons and staff to respect you and to respect this library and to think they all need to pitch in and do a good job because you folks are doing a good job, then you need to do a good job. You need to come to these meetings prepared. You need to not waggle around and waffle around on issues for hours at an end. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the last meeting where in 5 hours you folks accomplished almost nothing. Now, there have been some changes that are good to see, and I'll get into those later this evening. But if you want to model for staff what effective and efficient staff meetings would look like, you should do those yourselves. Does that make sense? I hope it does. It's been a long day, but the idea is, again, one more time, you are the model. You show staff and everyone in the community what's expected of those at the library. And if you're not doing a good job, why should anyone else do a good job? Thank you.
Okay, before we move on to item 3, You've got another public comment, is that
Yeah.
right, Mr. Amy?
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm not sure where this public comment is best placed. But this has been an issue that's been of concern for a long time. There's an item in this library, probably older than any other item in terms of the actual physical age. And it was created 123 years ago. It's a piece of Altadena's history and heritage. It is an amazing piece of artwork. And years ago, the then director of the library pointed out that it was in desperate and dire need of repair and rehabilitation before it was lost. Nothing has been done to the piece of artwork known as Millard Canyon at Granite Gate, painted in 1896 by George Gardner Simmons, which hangs up in the library. Years ago, Mindy Kattay pointed out that this needed assistance and called on the Altadena Library Foundation to raise funds, and apparently the foundation agreed to do so. But there has been no oversight or effort by this board to make sure that that project occurs. And so that amazing piece of artwork, which is noted for its incredible imagery of our local hills, continues to degrade to the point that if it isn't repaired soon, we're going to lose it. So I've heard members of this board point out that they are trustees. That piece of artwork was given to this library in trust, in the public trust. It is ours, members of the public. You folks are responsible for it. I'd like to know what's going to happen to that. If it should be given to a different institution that can actually care for it properly, or if this library district will actually take care of that piece of invaluable art. Thank you.
Can you clarify if this money's already been raised? Can we go to?
It hasn't.
It has not. Okay.
Thanks.
So,
All right, we're on to item number 3, and we have with us tonight Seth Merowitz from BB&K, who will be...
My most humble apologies. I messed up the order of my comments.
We were
And I
confused.
And it's too late.
Because of the topic that you were talking about?
I thought you had shifted, and I didn't realize what topic it was that you were talking about. I thought it was the library foundation.
Do you have an agenda?
Do you have an agenda?
And I screwed up. I just wanted to point that
They're
out.
on the back.
I appreciate that. People must be wondering what's wrong with it.
Okay, yes, we are on 3A. Seth Merowitz from BB&K will be presenting a little refresher course for us as part of our Brown Act training series. We will have to turn around for this.
Thank you. Let's see. We need to just give it a minute here. My name is Seth Merowitz. I'm a partner with Best Best & Krieger. Here tonight for Ruben Duran, who had a conflict. I understand it's your practice now to have a little Brown Act refresher on various topics. And so I prepared one for you tonight. Let me see if I'm going to remind later. Okay. So we have a brief presentation. Is it possible to get a little bit of light? Just to just read my notes. So we wanted to talk, really about public comments at meetings. That was the sort of discrete topic to address tonight. We can go into a little depth. I'm happy to take questions. So really the Brown Act is here to guarantee the public right to attend and participate in meetings of local legislative body. You are a local legislative body. You are subject to the Brown Act. All meetings are to be open to the public, and all persons must be permitted to attend a meeting. So then what is a meeting? That is a question. We just to take it up for a second. A meeting is when a majority of the members come together at the same time to hear, discuss, or deliberate any matter that is under the jurisdiction of the district. No action must be taken in order for the meeting to occur. Just getting together and discussing is sufficient to consider it a meeting. Any meeting of the legislative body should be open and persons should be able to attend. Now, what's not a meeting? If you have individual contact with somebody at the market or the farmer's market, or if you're at a conference or a seminar, if you're at a community meeting and you're not conferencing together, but that you just happen to all be there individually, if you're at some sort of ceremonial or social occasion, if you're attending as an observer to a standing committee, that would not necessarily be a meeting, even though all three of you may be there. And I say three because that's a quorum of your body. So if you have any two, that's not a meeting. It's once you hit three, that's the magic number. Once you have a quorum, that you're then subject to these requirements. If you go together to some other meeting, some other public meeting, city council or board of supervisors, that would not necessarily be a meeting. Ad hoc is an interesting situation. If you have an ad hoc committee that is a standing committee, then it's got to follow the Brown Act requirements of notice and opportunity for people to attend. If you have a meeting of any two of you as an ad hoc meeting, again, not a quorum, but two of you, you can get together and talk about items and you're not subject. Of course, you can't have a serial meeting. You can't try and make decisions together and have two meetings and then two others and whatnot. But I just wanted to put this out there, again, to talk about transparency, which is the goal. So there are different types of meetings that you have. You have regular meetings. Regular meetings require that an agenda is placed 72 hours before the meeting. You must have the time and the place of the meeting. You have to make notices available and different formats to comply with the American Disabilities Act. When you're in a regular meeting during public comment, there's no requirement that there be any action or discussion. In fact, if something's really not on the agenda, you don't have the ability to act on it without bringing something onto the agenda as an urgency item or an emergency item. That's a special case. If you have public comments during the meeting, you are able, if you choose, to make a brief response to a question, to reference something to staff, make some type of an announcement, or if you feel that something needs to be added to the agenda, there are different requirements, whether it's 2/3 or 4/5, depending on the item, but things can be added to the agenda. But suffice it to say, if it's not on the agenda, you really can't act on it. The public comment is the time for you to receive the comments of the public, not necessarily to engage or to act. Special meetings are a little bit different. Special meetings can be called not with 72, but with a 24-hour requirement. The items have to be on there, but there's no requirement that public comment be available on any item. There would be public comment on the item that's being decided upon, but there's not a need for public comment on any item that's not on the agenda. There are emergency meetings. These can be called, they have to be 1 hour ahead of time. This has to be a dire emergency, really to prevent an impairment to public health and safety. That's a very unique situation, and hopefully the library district does not encounter that. So the right to comment, wanted to give some limitations, not some limitations, but to expand on it a little bit more. So the public right to comment, members of the public have the right to address the council, the district, on any items. Certainly during public comments, doesn't have to relate to anything. They can really speak about anything they wish, but when it is on an agenda item, they really have to speak to that agenda item. And best practice is that during the public comment period, they are not addressing specific items on the agenda. That would happen at the time that agenda item comes up. Move through this to get to. So there are courts have ruled on permissible ways to regulate this public comment. The district here is considered a limited public forum. So you have the authority to limit speech through agendas and rules of order and decorum. but you have to be careful that these limitations don't act as prior restraints. You don't want to get into prohibiting any criticism of your actions or your policies. Those are what the public comment is really here to elicit from the public. And as such, you should be very open to that. You wouldn't want any policy that's going to restrict that in any way. There can be limitations on the request to speak, such that you can have the cards that you fill out, so it's not there can be an orderly fashion to allow people to speak. In turn, there also can be time limitations. I believe this body has a 3-minute time limitation. The average 1 to 5 is sort of what we see. If you have a translation going on, a real-time translation, that person has to be given twice the amount of time if that occurs in that situation. That's something that is codified in law. If comments are repetitive or irrelevant, then they can be limited. The legislative body can restrict that speaker if they're speaking too long or being unduly repetitive or extending irrelevancies, and that really, that decision is vested with your chairperson to make that decision. There are requirements that if groups of people are speaking on an issue, that there can be spokespersons appointed to, again, have a more orderly approach. If there are large numbers of people speaking on a particular subject matter, you are allowed to limit the speech in that way. Just a couple of others. So speakers can be ruled out of order for cause if they're being disruptive, if they're being argumentative, but they really cannot be ruled out of order for the substance of their comment. If they say something you don't like, that is not ruling them out. But if they're being repetitive, if they're being argumentative, if they're being threatening in some way, then you do have the right to limit the speech. And that's really the final point. If there's disruption going on, if there's fighting words, as the courts have taken up now for 50 years, then that can be restricted, and that speaker can be asked to give up the podium at that time. So this is a brief overview. I'm happy to answer any questions. If the chair would like to take questions.
I don't have any questions myself. Does anybody else on the
I
board?
do. I have a couple.
Okay.
And the audience might too, Karen.
You had mentioned that in a committee where a third board member is attending as an observer, that not necessarily be subject to the Brown Act, but what kinds of restrictions are there on the behavior of the observer?
Right, and that's a great question. When you're acting as the board, you have certain power that's vested with you. If you have committees or subcommittees, when you attend, you really are there as an observer. Your voice should not be heard there,
Literally.
essentially. Right, you're there as an observer. You get your chance, right? Your subcommittees report to you ultimately. But when you're there as an observer, you're there to watch. You're encouraged. You know, this is America. We're happy to have you come to the meeting. But once you start participating, that changes the nature of that speech. So it's really a best practice that if you choose to attend, which you're welcome to, if you're there as an observer, not a speaker.
My other question had to do not so much with public comment, but with the different definitions of meetings.
Sure.
There were some problems before most of us were on this board about regular meetings getting rescheduled. And I just want to clarify if that's even permissible. I know, we approve every year of a whole yearly schedule of meetings, and there were attempts to just change the date of one of those meetings to a week later. I'm guessing that wasn't okay. It seemed like there were objections to it at the time, and that if for whatever reason the business that couldn't get done at the meeting that couldn't happen for whatever reason, what should have happened was the scheduling of a special meeting. Is that correct? correct?
So, I'm not gonna comment on specifics, I don't know
Sure.
all the facts involved, but once you set your regular meeting, that's your meeting. If you have some other meeting, then it's not your regular meeting, it would be a special meeting
Right.
or an emergency meeting. So,
So the definition of a regular meeting is whatever the annual schedule says it is.
that's correct.
Got it.
You've scheduled
Thought
it,
Okay.
and there can be adjourned meetings. If you take up an item and you don't finish it, you can pause and adjourn to a different time that you set. That can be permitted.
So that would be like that regular meeting, part 2?
Essentially,
Essentially?
right. You're adjourning to a time specific, and that time specific, everyone's given notice of, and
Okay.
and proper noticing takes
Okay.
place.
I do have a question down based on Betsy's, and that is, what if you can't muster a quorum, sort of an emergency situation, someone's sick or whatever? Do those get rescheduled, under a different category, or do we have to wait until the very next scheduled meeting? How would that work?
So to act, you need a quorum. That's number one. If you can't raise a quorum, you don't have the authority to act. If you set a meeting and you don't get a quorum, then you need to renotice that next special meeting or emergency meeting.
Okay, that's the category would fall under a special or an emergency
I
meeting.
mean, the idea of a special meeting is that it's 24 hours and it's on a specific topic. That's the only thing you're there for. So there's no public comment on any topic other than that particular action that needs to be taken. So it's a special category. It does limit the public's right to comment, but it's a limited purpose meeting.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Terry, so again, back to Terry's question about it, let's say we have our yearly schedule of meetings, the April meeting comes up, and only 2 people can come. Can the 2 people who can come and have an adjourned meeting that you mentioned? Is that what you called it?
No, if you don't have a quorum, you don't have
You
a
can't do
meeting.
anything. So basically, anything that would have happened at that April meeting just has to wait until May.
If you don't have a quorum, you don't have a meeting.
We get the calendar together.
Yeah. Okay. I will allow a question or two. I'd like to keep the meeting rolling in the spirit of comments and stuff. Let's start with you, Mark. You went
So a
first.
quick one. So the ad hoc committee meetings, so some ad hoc committees have no public people on them, and tonight we're going to hear about the strategic committee that has some public in it. But they still are not of the quorum, I mean, they're not a full board. But they still, do ad hoc committee meetings still have to be agendized and publicized for their date? And then are the public allowed to come to those, even though then, because it's not a regular meeting, they just can't give comments, but they can listen?
Right. So it's a great question, because ad hoc is used in different ways. If it's an ad hoc that's a regularly occurring ad hoc committee, right, then it starts to take on the requirements of an agenda and public comment, right? At that point, it's a committee. Now, if you have an instance where 2 of the board members choose to get together to talk about something, that does not have to be open to the public. They don't have a quorum. It's not a regularly standing meeting, right? So that's,
Well, not the 2 people getting, if you have an ad hoc committee that says,
if there's a standing ad hoc committee that meets monthly like a strategic plan, then that's.
for a short period of time,
For a
6
short
months.
period, but if it takes on a purpose and it has a regular meetings, then it really should be agendized and treated like a proper meeting.
That's not what the lawyer said last time. The other one got from the He said if it was less than 6 months, it was different. It wasn't considered like a standing committee, because the argument was Betsy and Terry are gonna be interviewing for a new director, and the public should not be there because it's confidential stuff. And then the strategic planning committee is 2 members plus public people on the committee. But the guy, if I remember correctly, said if it's a committee that's gonna be less than 6 months, then it's not, it doesn't have to be open to the public and be agenda. Am I wrong?
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I think that's what he said.
Yeah, can I jump in for a second? So, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong. So, a standing committee, right, has a fixed purpose and like a regular meeting schedule, and it does the same thing all the time on a regular basis, subject to the Brown Act, has to be agendized, has to be publicized. A less than quorum ad hoc committee is what many of ours are, right? Like bylaws or executive search or facilities, right? So that's less than a quorum, so it can only be 2 trustees, nobody else. Not subject to the constraints of the Brown Act, limited scope, limited duration. exists for a certain period of time to do a specific thing. There are also special committees, which is what you get when you have an ad hoc committee that you add additional people to, right? So it's still limited in scope and duration. It exists for a certain amount of time to do a specific thing, but that's like the strategic planning committee. So by adding members of the public to it, or members of staff, or even potentially other trustees, at that point it does become subject to the constraints of the Brown Act. It is technically a legislative body, has to be agendized, has to be publicly noticed, has to allow public comment, all the regular things that you would have to do at a public meeting. Is that correct?
Sounds correct.
I think it's also my understanding from these previous discussions is a lot of it's determined by how the board votes to create and establish these committees, right? So we've decided, like the facilities committee, for instance, is not necessarily regularly scheduled, it is truly ad hoc, so it has to follow certain rules, versus we made a very public conscious decision on the strategic planning committee to do something different. And so it's because we constituted it in a different way, it's more like we have to understand that based upon how we approve the creation of the committee, there's certain rules that that's how I took it.
Yeah, I think, the best practice is to identify which committees are meeting and are considered standing committees, meeting regularly, take on all of the obligations of the Brown Act. And if it's not on that list, then arguably it's truly ad hoc. It's going to meet for a limited purpose, a limited duration, and not have to take on all the formalities of the Brown Act.
Okay, one more brief question
Yeah,
from Renee.
just real quickly, there's different ways of looking at the Brown Act in terms of its limitations on action. And the current agenda says that the Brown Act does not allow the board to take action on any item not on the agenda in terms of public comment. But I want to make sure that it's clear that members of the board can indeed react to public comment, indeed engage with public commenters, and then engage with staff, direct staff, to prepare a report for the next meeting based on public comment, and then take action based on that report, for example.
So what I would offer is that they can if they choose, but they're not
If they
required.
choose, if they choose, but there's no requirement that says they can't actually react and they can't question staff.
The public is encouraged and free to speak within limitations, and the board is certainly also free to speak as they wish within limitations. It's really a best practice that during public comments, it doesn't get into a discussion, it doesn't get into a back and forth. The best practice is that the public is free to say what they want, and then the board can direct staff, the board can make a minor response, or the board can choose to do nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my understanding on that we got it in our bylaws that we can make a brief comment or answer a question briefly, but it does not, it cannot result in a dialogue between the audience and the board.
And that's best practice.
Okay, thank you, Seth. Appreciate it. We've got two speakers now before the next item, and Mark, I'll let you go. Actually, three speakers. This is the point at which we talked about putting.
Yeah, not the 4-H, but the
Oh,
Friends of the Library.
we're doing friends, okay.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Just really quick for the record, I'm going to record Mr. Amy's previous comment under 7C, because it sounded like that's where it was meant to go. I was a little confused, but I don't know.
The one about the, she's going to record his comment about the painting.
Right.
Under 7C.
Okay.
Mark Mariscal, President of the Friends of the Altadena Library. So thank you for moving the agenda item. So the Friends had a pop-up sale this past weekend and did, as Granny has whispered in my ear, more than $1,000, which for a pop-up is really good. And so, but I know it hasn't moved enough boxes and items out of the room downstairs. And so I give you that thought because Bridget, who's the president of the foundation, Bridget and I met with Cindy last week just to get to know each other and talk about a couple of things. And one of the items that we spoke about was kind of a quick little follow-up to something that was spoken about at the Friends board meeting last month. And so it is a challenge with the storage of the books. That was 3 minutes already? I don't think so, but, so anyway, I just want to let you know that we did that. I will talk on 4A about money real quick, so I'm going to come back on that one. And then I do just want to leave a thought of what Seth said, and I'm going to talk about this from the Friends' point of view, is just because a ad hoc committee has 2 members and doesn't need to follow the Brown Act, doesn't mean that in the spirit you can't do it. You know, meaning you can do it. And, so that people can actually come and listen. They don't have to comment, but they can come and hear what's going on at the facilities and or the bylaws or whichever ones they are, right? So something to think about, because I do know the Friends were a little upset at the last director at different times. And so whatever transparency is there helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Good evening, Cynthia Carmona with the Altadena Library Foundation. I am not Bridget, but I did want to make sure that we noticed, you guys, that we did have a new election of officers in January, and Bridget was chosen as our new president. Mark will remain treasurer, and Cynthia Kumanchek will also remain as secretary. Our next meeting will be on March 20th, because we are moving to an every other month schedule now that we're all up on members to our board, and we are next really looking forward to just participating in the strategic planning process in concert with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, Renee?
Thank you. Because I messed up earlier, and I appreciate staff's noticing that, I'm going to follow up on Mark's comments regarding the Brown Act issues, and that is that 2 thoughts. One, this board had promised the community that it would do a Brown Act brush-up session at every meeting. That didn't happen last month. That's not on the community. That's on the board. There's been no explanation as to why that's been the case. You didn't follow up on your promise. The other thought in all of this, and again to segue and follow up on what Mark said, you've heard before that the Brown Act is the floor. It's the minimum standard of openness. Okay? You guys can be as open as you want. You can notice everything months and months and months in advance. You don't have to be 72 hours. Nothing wrong with 73, 74, 96, whatever it is that staff can meet. The reports and all that stuff should be in probably a week ahead of time, at least, to allow staff to make sure that everything that goes out to the public looks as sharp and as good as it can, that page numbers are there for ready reference, that all the reports are done and ready to go, so that you guys look good and as much information is out in the hands of the public as early as possible. Again, remember, minimum standards. And one other thought, Brown Act, you break it, you can always fix it. Okay, that's one of the beauties. It's not like the Public Records Act, it's not like a lot of laws where if you break it, you broke it, and there's no recourse. Brown Act, it happens all the time. You don't have to have an expensive, highly paid lawyer here reminding you of these simple facts and features. Thank you.
Okay, I don't believe there's any more speakers on this item, so we're moving on now to new business, and we've got the mid-year budget adjustment presentation. Nicole will start us off on this.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for the late revision today. Cindy Byram from Platinum Consulting came in today, and she had pointed out some revenue that we had overlooked, so we wanted to make sure that we included that for the presentation tonight. So on this updated report, you'll see highlights for both revenue and expenses. I'm going to go ahead and let Cindy Byram talk about revenue with you guys, and then I can follow up with you. And then I'll go ahead and just kind of give an overview of expenses, some highlights, and then if you have any questions, either Cindy B, Cindy C, or myself should be able to answer them.
Thank you.
Now, Cindy, you're welcome to use the podium if you'd like, or if you're more comfortable there.
I don't mind sitting, it's fine with me.
Okay.
But if you'd like me to stand, I'm happy to stand too.
You know what, Cindy, could you come up just so everybody in the audience?
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that would be a good move.
Not a problem.
So I already introduced myself to 4 of you, and I've met you before. I'm the owner of Platinum Consulting Group. I was with the district, I've been with the district for about 2 years. About a year ago, I hired on Paul Kmark, and he has since left effective last week to go back to auditing. It's his true love, it's what he loves to do, and he's an auditor at heart, so the consulting business wasn't as appealing as auditing. I have no idea why, it sounds horribly boring to me. But anyways, so that's who I am. So I will be back involved with the district again instead of Paul. We also have, on a regular basis, we do the bank reconciliations, and I have my staff, Ian, work on that, and as well as some of the budget things, and then I review everything. So the buck stops with me. So that's why I'm talk about your budget now. I get to do the fun part where your revenues are going up, and then Nicole can do the bad part. But a lot of the major revenues that are increasing is your property tax revenue. Your secured property tax revenue, we increased for an additional $65,000 because we have received an additional $65,000 than what was budgeted. As well as the per parcel benefit assessment, which is based on a percentage of assessed value, an additional $18,000, and an additional $20,000 for county interest that was not budgeted, and I don't know the reason why behind that. I wasn't privy to that, but for a total of an increase in your income of $122,000 for the year. That's the good part. Do you have any questions on that?
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
So can we just clarify on these line items which thing is which? So current 4010 and 4020, can you just briefly explain the difference between those two, please?
The secured property, I think the unsecured property is like, it's not real estate. The secured property is real estate, like residential homes, commercial buildings.
Okay. So what would fall into the unsecured?
Property taxes, there's general property taxes, like a lot of businesses pay property taxes on the equipment, computer equipment they own.
Okay.
My water districts pay on, well, they don't pay anymore, so they're not a good example. Pay property taxes on a copier lease if you own a copier, things of that nature.
Okay. And then can you just briefly explain 4220, the county interest allocation, what that is and where that comes from?
That's interest that you receive for monies that is held with the county. And so I believe there was a recent transfer made to put more money in there because the county's paying particularly good interest rates.
Thank you.
I think that money, wasn't it moved from Chase?
Yes. It was moved out of Chase and into the county.
Yeah.
Anything else?
So
Okay.
where did you
Nicole,
get
what
the
do you think?
65? I see 85 down here, the budget. Property tax income account, 85,000. You said something about 65?
The 4010 account, which is the secured property tax, went up by $65,000.
Okay.
If you look in the kind of the revisions column. So that's the very first property taxes line.
Okay.
That was the 65 I was referencing.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All righty. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the expenses, right? Is that your job, Nicole?
Yes, that's my job. So Cindy touched on property taxes. There are a few more highlights from revenue. Very generous donations from both the Friends and the Foundation. And then as she said, we moved the bulk of our funds out of Chase and into the county because the interest rate was so much better. We primarily use credit cards to pay as many bills as we can, so we're getting great cash back from using that. And then,
Nicole, I'm sorry to interrupt, but as you go through this, if you could point to the line or give us the number of the line that you're talking about, that would really help us
I
out.
can definitely do that. So 4210 is the Chase Bank account where we took the budgeted amount out because we moved all the money out of that account. 4999 is the credit card reward account, which we increased with that amount from Chase. 4220 is the county interest allocation that we already touched on, and then each property tax account, the 4010, the 4020, and the 4060, have all exceeded budget expectations by over 85,000 combined, so that does help with revenues. For expenses, unfortunately, we did have to increase a few line items, notably legal fees. We had to create a line item for the legal settlements. Those line items are 7130 and 7131. So that did take a chunk out of expenses. And then we also had to, unfortunately, contribute to our CERT trust this year, which we did not do last year. That line item is 5222. And then we're also having to pay our retiree health insurance payments, which we pay of course every year, but last year we reimbursed ourselves from the trust, and this year we are not able to do that. So that's line item 5221. So we budgeted 73,000 for that and 40,000 to pay into the trust for this year.
Can I interrupt on that line?
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit more? This is something that you had to opt out of this year. And I'm not familiar with some of these public trusts and insurance plans and so on.
No, not a problem.
What does that all mean?
So we offer something called OPEB, which is an other post-employment benefit. So for employees that have retired from our agency, they're eligible for health insurance for the rest of their life. We pay $500 and they pay anything over that. So generally that costs us about $73,000 a year. Simultaneously, for the last 5 years, we've been paying that bill, but we've also been paying into a trust that is held by CalPERS. It's the California Employers Retirement Benefit Trust. So we paid both for about 5 years, and there was enough money within the trust that we decided, okay, this last year, that we weren't going to contribute to the trust and we were going to reimburse ourselves, which we are allowed to do. We are allowed to use that trust fund specifically for that other post-employment benefit payment. So we did that last year and it zeroed out the line item. We didn't contribute and we didn't pay, or we reimbursed ourselves. So it was a zero line item, but this year we are not able to do that. The actuaries have insisted that we benefit, or that we contribute to the trust, and that we are not allowed to reimburse ourselves this year.
So is there a catch-up component to it as well, or is it just you don't do it 1 year and you do it the next year for the same amount?
Every year, every 2 years, you have to have an actuary come in and determine what's called your unfunded OPEB. And do you guys already know about this, or?
I'm
Unfunded
for one
liability?
learning, so.
Okay, so it's the portion of the liability that has not been set aside. And so that's the purpose of setting up the trust, is to send money to that trust to get that liability off your books. It's on your books right now as a liability, and you'll forgive me, I don't recall how much it was. I feel like it might have been 500,000, but I could be way off. So you make regular contributions. Well, when the actuary comes in and they'll look at what you've been contributing and what you've been paying on your own, they do a calculation that I couldn't explain to you. It's just what actuaries do, but they'll say, they'll tell you what your amount you should send to the trust should be for the next year, so that you don't fail a certain calculation they do called a crossover test, which could exponentially change the amount of that liability.
Okay, so it's prescribed according to a formula?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So I had this highlighted in my stuff too. So we couldn't reimburse ourselves because the actuarial, which is a required thing, said that based on the unfunded issue, that money had to stay in this year. That's why we couldn't reimburse.
Is there a standard timeline on that? Like, is it every 3 years? Is it something that happens on a regular basis, or is that dependent on how many retirees we have drawing that benefit?
The valuation will change and can change dramatically every 2 years, depending on, who you're paying and who's retired or who may have passed away. And also market changes and amounts that you put into the trust. Most of the agencies that I work with, and I have about, I'd say 30 different special district clients right now, ranging from fire districts to library districts to water districts. They have a trust, they contribute to that trust regularly until they get to the unfunded is zero. But then what happened, I had one that completely paid it off, but then the next valuation, the market kind of tanked and our investments didn't do as well, and we had more people retire, and then we were back to having an unfunded amount. So we went back to making regular contributions, but most of my agencies make a commitment that this is the amount we're gonna put in the trust, and we're gonna pay the retirees on our own until we get to that full amount in the trust.
So it functions more like a reserve, and then
Yes.
it just stays there indefinitely? Is that the idea, that you're not, so is it best practice to reimburse yourself on a regular basis, or to just
No.
leave it alone to keep the
It's
liability?
to leave it alone, and you wanna leave it alone so that that trust is, has different investment rules, and that's why it can earn a lot more money than you setting the money aside and lay for the county. So I don't have any agencies that pull from the trust. Now, at some point, you can, if it's fully funded and you need to ease some budgetary pressure, you can certainly start drawing off of it, and that would ease your budgetary pressure.
So ideally, in next year's budget, we would have a line item for the trust, and we would start that process again,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So do we know where we stand, like percentage-wise? Like, do we have a snapshot, like we're 70%, we're 50%?
I can look for you while Nicole's talking about the other things in my computer, and I'll be able to tell you.
I wanna have a sense of, is it bad, is it okay, is it,
I'll have a look,
Okay.
and then chime back.
Okay, so those were really the biggest expenses, the biggest line item increases for those 3 accounts. And then we did trim a little here and there where we could. We combined some accounts, we transferred from some accounts into others. I can go line by line if you guys want that much detail, or if you've had a chance to look at it and you just have some questions, that's totally fine.
I've seen it, I mean, I've gone through the lines, but I think it could be, I'll let you weigh in on that one. I'm happy just going to the highlights.
I have my question ready to go, so.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I've got questions as well. Go ahead.
This, I guess it's the back page here, the second bullet. I just wanna make sure I'm reading this right. So it looks like we moved 150,000 out of 7140 to pay for the legal bills. So I'm reading that right? Okay. So just being one of the new people on the block, I'm just trying to get a sense of, it's a pretty significant change, right? So I don't know if this is just a general question I'm asking, is if that's something that normally would come before the board before this decision is made. I can tell you, in our ad hoc meeting for the facilities, like I didn't know about that, right? So just some clarity would be helpful. It's putting it out in the universe.
Right, is that on? I'm good. Okay, so, originally we budgeted, 250,000 for capital, and I think we talked in the budget, or in the facilities meeting, that we were not able to spend that amount of money. We anticipated that it would be for the roof, but the roof ended up being a lot more than we thought, way beyond the 250. So the thought was to we probably will spend about 40, I think, plus, anticipating what might happen tonight, 50,000 would go to ADA architectural studies. And so we didn't think that we'd be able to spend this money between now and the end of the year, fiscal year.
You had a question, Katie?
I've got a whole list. Okay, so I'm gonna try to go in order, and if it doesn't make sense, then, I'm sorry in advance. Okay, so starting, I just wanna make sure I'm understanding a couple things. So, is it correct that we did an even swap between 7310 and 7180? That's the RFID stuff, right? So we just moved it out of, we were calling it technology, and we moved it into equipment, furniture, and fixes?
It's like capital.
Because this is gonna be remaining, and it's hardware, and so, presumably also we depreciate it in certain ways. Okay, cool. So that's an even swap.
Yes.
There's an $11,000, looks like even swap as well, between 6750 and 6970.
Yes, so that's for the equipment lease. We have a lease agreement with Wells Fargo for all of our multi-function machines within the district.
What does that mean?
The big copiers.
Oh, okay, great.
So we have 4 between both locations, and Christopher actually was the one who kind of retooled the lease for us. This was the first year we did it that way. So the budget numbers that we have were from the year even before that. He redesigned it so that we were paying less overall to print as much as humanly possible. So we print the newsletters here, we print all our flyers here, we do all that in-house now. So next year, those numbers won't need to switch. We'll have a baseline going forward.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. On 7140, architectural and engineering, that $50,000, can we just briefly talk about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, tonight, as part of the facilities budget, or facilities committee, we will be talking about that one, so maybe we can hold off on that until Jason gives his report.
Okay, but just I guess a question of process then, are we voting, we're voting tonight to approve this budget adjustment, is that correct?
That's correct.
So it might be helpful to know what those line items are before we vote to approve them.
So, at the facilities meeting, what we discussed was the possibility of engaging an architect to do an ADA study. So then that money was put into a more appropriate budget category.
Okay. And then what about the 7155 consultant budget? Because I noticed in both the strategic planning committee report as well as the executive search committee report, it looks like hiring on some consultants or facilitators to assist with the executive search and or strategic planning process might be recommended by those committees to the board. So what's the rationale for dropping that $75,000 budget by $25,000?
That's actually new information for me, so we're welcome to adjust that if need be.
Well, the budget is 75, so there's still money in that account.
Okay, so
And it was our assumption that as we went through the committee reports, that there may have to be adjustments to this budget. I mean, we can, I think we can approve this now, and then based on what happens with the committee reports, we can make adjustments.
I really wish that I had moved to move the committee reports before this now. And that is, hindsight is 20/20. Okay, so, right, so there's 50,000 in that consultant budget. And we've spent 19,000 some odd of it so far, correct? Is there a reason, and I guess that this is just a question of like curiosity, is there a reason that having like an ADA consultant gets a separate line item? Do you know what I mean? Like, is that just to separate it out into like a building thing versus a consultant thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just dependent on the budget category.
Okay.
And I mean, just to add to that, we can always consolidate it.
Right.
But we've chosen to break it out.
Okay. And then just, Can we talk about 7175 internet service dropped 20 grand due to, it says anticipated reimbursement from E-rate? What does that mean?
That's a better question for Christopher. I'll do my best. So we apply for E-rate reimbursements every year. They pay for our internet service. They used to pay the full amount. They're paying less and less. So that's why I'm not anticipating a full reimbursement, but at least half.
Okay. And so bottom line on all of this is if we approve this budget as laid out here in the revised form, we need to pull $213,000 out of our reserves. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. How often are we paying money into those reserves and how long will it take to replenish that amount? Or are we paying into our reserves on a regular basis? How does that work?
So not necessarily. Most of our money is stored with the county, and we always keep a minimum of half a year's operating expenses in that account. That's our general policy. Our revenue has been increasing steadily over the last few years, as is kind of seen here with the increase in property taxes. And I don't anticipate it taking more than a year or two to replenish that amount.
Okay.
So is it just simply a matter of at the end of the budget year, whatever we've got left over we haven't spent goes into the reserve?
Yes.
There's nothing beyond that, it's just literally what is that dollar amount at the end of the budget year?
I did have one more question. I'm sorry, I skipped this line. So under library materials, there are 3 line items: books, CDs, DVDs, and video games. And it looks like we spent $35,000 less on actual library materials, like books and things, than was anticipated. And I guess I was just curious as to whether that was due to decisions from collections or whether it was because our head of collections was doing other things, and so like that process got delayed a little bit.
I will answer that one. It was definitely as a result of workload and then not being able to do as much as we would like to do.
Okay, so that was my guess. So ideally, like, had we had normal staffing, we would have been able to spend that money. And
My goal would always to be able to spend every single cent that we have on materials.
okay, great.
My only concern was that we're spending, according to this, looks like we cut the budget by half almost. Is that right? You had, of the original budget set at $335,000? And now you're cutting it, you're saying you're over budget by 154?
Well, this is based on expenditures to date. So we still will be buying materials between now and we'll probably stop mid-June.
Okay. So, okay.
It's only being lowered by 35,000,
Yeah.
and 15 of it is the
Still has
library of things.
Stella?
So I did want to just touch on the library of things. That was a new line item this year. It has been our goal to start collecting non-traditional library materials. So some libraries rent out, or not rent out, but they provide sports equipment or power tools or a wide variety of things. So this is one of the goals for this library, is to start looking at other non-traditional materials. So this is why this year we had created the Library of Things budget. It's been our hope for the last 2 years to start with creating some children's backpacks that could be filled with kits and science-related materials that they could check out and go on hikes with their families and so forth. And so that's where the Library of Things material item budget would be using. But due to a variety of factors this year, we're just not going to be able to really pursue that type of collection. We are keeping $5,000 in the Library of Things, though, so that we can at least this year purchase 3 telescopes that we will have available for some of our programming, and then we're going to eventually kind of retrofit those slightly so that they will be available for checkout. So that's why we did keep $5,000 in the Library of Things budget.
It's audio visual.
Can I ask one more reserves projection question. And I know that this is a little unfair because this is sort of a question about next year's budget, really, more than it is about revising what's left of this year. So is the idea that we would be able to, with the $200-some-odd thousand we're moving out of reserves, build that reserve back up within a year? Is that based on a projected budget that contains higher legal fees going forward, or based on a projected budget that contains legal fees similar to what we had budgeted in the past?
More similar to what we had budgeted in the past. I think we might budget a little bit higher since we do seem to be using legal quite a bit more than we used to. But last fiscal year we did earn almost $700,000, more than the previous year that was able to go into reserves. So that's kind of worst case scenario, that it would take a year or two. I don't anticipate it really taking more than that.
Okay, thank you. That's all for me.
I do have your answer now. The total OPEB liability on your books is $1.6 million. Of that, you have $535,000 in the trust. So you're about a third funded, which, I mean, honestly is more than some of my other districts. Many of my districts are between just started funding or between like 20 and 70%, generally speaking.
Just ask, what comprises the formula that creates the liability number? What is that?
So what goes into it is the actuaries will calculate what the cost for this year is. That's called your service cost. So, because every year that goes on, somebody gets closer to retirement age. So that changes the liability. And then they go through and they say who's married and they do mortality rates and so on. But then there's also a component of that is your employer contributions, like when she pays for the retiree benefits, that reduces your liability. So they take that off. There's also any contributions you make to the trust reduces the liability. And there is also a component of interest that they add on that increases the liability, that they say that, you know, that's also an added cost.
So it's actuarial magic, like they do.
It is, yes, it is.
A lot of stuff goes into that.
Is that just on the retiree health insurance?
As part of the health insurance too.
Yes, this is just retiree.
You have more, Nicole?
No, I think that about sums it up, just that final figure, that it would be $213,000 being transferred in from reserves.
Thank you. When you look at these budget numbers, it's obviously apparent that you took a big hit on legal fees and settlement fees and litigation, as we said, for a one-time event. The legal fees, to everybody's question, are starting to wind down now. I think that you've seen that yourselves in the bills that have become public, and I expect that to happen as we go forward as well. But however you slice this, we're borrowing money basically this year to fund whatever projects we would like to do, including the ADA things, facilities, all the other stuff. So this is sort of a best case scenario for us if we want to add money to fund some of the things that we'd like to see move forward, and we'll talk about that later. Now, from a structural point of view, I'm going to ask you, Seth, is it possible for us to defer a vote on this until we talk about the items, the committee items? Because each one of us out of committee, I believe, may have a request for funds that we'd like to know that they're secure before we make a vote on this. I know it's going to get messy and it's going to get long, but I think that might be a good way to do this. And I'd ask the board for their blessing on that approach, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'd move to postpone this until after item 7 is completed.
Okay, so we would postpone, we had the presentation, we would postpone the vote. Do we need to make a vote on that, on reordering the agenda set?
I think you should make a vote on reordering it. You also want to consider whether you want to take public comment now or later.
Okay.
Or both. There should be public comment on the item at some point.
Yep.
Well, I think public comment on that item now is the way to go, and we'll get that over with. And so I'm sorry that I'm at a loss to who, both of you would like to speak to this?
Of course.
Okay. Let's start with Renee this time, Mark, because you started last time.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out the $213,000 being moved basically out of savings. And that should be of concern. And I would recommend you go back to the budget book for this year so that you can see exactly how that occurred and how the planning phases for this budget and this year's spending were created and determined, and how it all integrates together. That would be a great thing to do, except you can't, because by the wisdom of an earlier board, you don't have a budget book. You should be asking how the budget book for the next year is going to be developed, so that you all don't have to sit here floundering around, wondering how and why, and looking like you don't understand the process, because there should be a budget book before you now that you can refer to. That has been the case in prior years, but it isn't the case now. Additionally, I believe staff should get a shout out for using the term "we." We did this, we did that, we created a special, we bumped up the numbers. Staff doesn't really have the authority to spend more in a given category than you allow them. You, this board, created a budget of $25,000 for this year for legal fees. You, this board, have spent way more than that. Staff fell on their sword, joining themselves in with you and not making it clear that it was by your decision, not by an acting director, an interim acting director, or whatever director's choice. It was this board's choice. Now, fortunately, we all have our rear ends covered here in this library district because of rising property taxes. The fact that it costs $750,000 or more to buy a shack in Altadena is the reason that you folks aren't desperately seeking money to pay for those attorneys that you hired. So I think you really need to own that. There shouldn't be any we when it comes to that. It should really, staff is doing you a credit, but it should be you folks who are the ones responsible for the need to move all that money out of savings. Thank you.
Mark Marisco. So a couple different things. One, when Cindy and I met with Bridget last week, so there might have been maybe a little misunderstanding. So on the $5,000 extra in the foundation, it is available between now and June 30th, but we go on a calendar year, so it's really available all the way through December. So I would just caution you that Cindy will come to us with maybe something you want to spend, but whatever you're going to spend on that $5,000 is actually going to get then offset with expenses. So to show it as revenue, it probably shouldn't be there. So I suggest that, first of all. Second thing is, on your CalPERS on the retirees, this board, and I was a trustee, and at that time we used to pay $400 a month for retiree health insurance. It's up to $500, and that's it. You can choose to raise it to whatever level. Some public entities don't even pay for retiree health insurance. Others do. I'm a fortunate one that comes from an agency that pays for two-party for lifetime. It's rare. But my point being is, you know that it's $6,000 a year for every retiree you have. And so your actuaries, when you asked about that, is basically if somebody's averaging 21 years, you know, you've got to have that pot of money for that person that retires. And then, of course, the calculation of what Cindy said, I think it was Cindy, I apologize, you know, that whole thing. I do want to go back to Paul, though. I stood here just, I think it was last month or the month before, when Paul said, on behalf of your company, that the reason they were moving the money, that he was making the suggestion for Nicole and at the time Mindy or Ryan, to move that money back and forth was to take advantage of the CalPERS interest. Now, could be good, could be bad, but under the prudent, conservative way, what she's suggesting now is you just pay it annually as you go along, is a much better way. I kind of questioned that, but nobody really wanted to deal with it. And then the other thing is, I want to remind you, I'm not in the same kind of an agreement, not even close, on the idea, the reason you have savings and the reason you have reserves, and your reserves, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole or Cindy, it was somewhere in the excess of $3 million, of which you've got to keep a minimum of 1.6 or 1.7, kind of half of your year. And so the rest of the money you could spend tonight. You could allocate it, well, it's not on the agenda yet, but you could allocate it next month, right? The whole point of the reserves is, again, is to fall back for the elections and to fall back for emergencies. But the other reason I want to say something about the reserves is the fact that I've brought up so far in the last 2 meetings, and I'm going to continue to do it, and I said this to Cindy the other day, and I might have said it to you, Terry, is the importance of the strategic plan group and the funding mechanism going down the road, that you bond some future dollars off of your property tax that would allow you to do some very good big capital improvements. So you have right now a good $1 million that can go for capital and still have $600,000 left even after you deal with the adjustment of settlements or some amount. So anyway, all of that, thank you. Not enough time because I didn't get that.
Okay, then now, oh, sorry. Would someone else like to speak?
I was making up time.
Now, procedurally, my understanding is we would take a vote to move this vote, approving this budget review or budget adjustment until after we hear the reports from the committees. So, do I have a motion for that?
I'll make the motion, but let me try and get my language clear here. So the motion would be to move a vote on the amended budget to after item 7 on the posted agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be this guy. Nobody likes this guy. Technically, I think we need a motion to approve the agenda, or excuse me, a motion to approve the budget, and then we have a motion to postpone that vote to after item 7, and then we can come back and actually vote on that. But we haven't had a motion to approve this yet, so we can't move to postpone it until we have a motion to do it in the first place. We can vote to reorder the agenda, but that's something else.
Okay, so I just phrased my request wrong then.
Well, no, I thought your request was to reorder the agenda.
Okay.
Move the entire item.
Move the entire item.
Right, move the entire item to after the financial or the committee reports that we have. So we would be moving this till after 7B.
That is my intent, if that works for everybody.
I think it does, yes. So is there a second to that?
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you.
Excuse me, would you like me to stay? I'm happy to stay. Or it's totally up to you.
I think we're good.
I was just trying to save you some money.
I really appreciate that.
I think most of the things we'll talk about have to do with expenses, basically.
That's what I think,
And
yeah.
I don't think it'll
Okay.
be very little
All right,
about
thank
revenue.
Thank you
Okay, we are on now to item 4B, which is review of legal services. I know, Mr. Amy, you want to speak to this, is that right?
Yes, thank you. I have some concerns and comments regarding this item. You have before you, and the public has before it, a letter from your legal counsel suggesting that releasing this information to the public could be detrimental to any position held by the library. And so you have exceedingly redacted, if you will, or limited, I should say, exceedingly limited amounts of information before you in terms of the billings. For example, you do not have, and perhaps legal counsel decided that because it had been provided to you previously, you no longer needed the $9,999 with the $1 discount to make it under that $10,000 threshold for the Boderud report that I handed to you at an earlier meeting. That was billed and paid for. In fact, it was paid for the day after it was received. I don't know exactly who paid for it, but perhaps you folks should, be concerned about that. That you're not getting necessarily all the information you should have before you. It's also very difficult to review information when you can't compare and contrast. If you're looking at concerns as to what's been the history of costs in various and sundry elements and areas, if there's no staff report indicating that information for prior years to refer to, you're operating in the blind. And I think that does a disservice to you, and it does, here we go again, it's a disservice to you folks, it's a disservice to the taxpayers, it's a disservice to the patrons, and it's a disservice to the staff. So again, I gave you an invoice for $9,999. Where is it in your stack now? And do you care? That's really the issue. And what will it take to get this library's legal fees back down to the level that they were prior to the hiring of the current legal counsel, an organization, a company that was not recommended by staff, but was selected at the recommendation of a board member who is no longer on this board and approved by a majority board of board members who are no longer on this board. So things to think about as you ponder the information before you. Thank you.
Okay, with that, no more speakers to this. We'll move on to this review of legal services. And I think this was placed on the agenda collectively with my understanding, the spirit of trying to rein in and review more closely and more real time, I believe, the legal expenses that we're incurring. We had so much going on these last few months that we were keeping an eye on these things, but I believe we could have done a better job. And so that, to me, is the topic to discuss tonight. And I guess I'd like to open it up to any comments that the other trustees have.
So I'll just say something about process very briefly. So obviously the board received a copy of the memo that's in the board packet, but then we also received copies of every single bill that's been sent to date by BB&K. So we have the full bills with all the details. Obviously those particulars are privileged unless the board decided to waive those. But so we have had the opportunity to see that information. And I think it should also be noted that the library or the district was not charged for the preparation of this information.
Thank you. Any other comments from trustees?
I know I asked for this issue to be placed on the agenda. My specific motivation, frankly, was I think we have a fiduciary responsibility to be taking steps that you mentioned, Terry, like we acting in a way that is ensuring that the money's being spent most appropriately, proper oversight and all that. And I think I personally don't feel as though there's any dispute as far as the quality and the accuracy of the work that's been done by BB&K. My personal issue is that we are a different entity than others, right? If you are, a senator of the United States, you frankly don't care about legal bills because whatever has to be spent to protect your status, that is what it is. I think we're in a situation, we have an extremely limited budget, it's all public funds. I think we need to be in a situation where the first question how we're dealing with legal issues and costs is somebody providing us with options, what those cost options are, so that we can make educated decisions versus simply all this work needs to be done, so let's just pay it whatever it costs. And I think that's where we need to get to. I also think that means having an open discussion of where can we place limitations. It seems to me that right now there are no limitations as far as the interaction between any one of us 5 certain staff and our legal counsel, which can quickly run up bills, versus, and granted, we have only had interim directors for some time, so I'm sure that's part of it, but versus a scenario in which, frankly, the go-between or mediator, whatever phrase you want to use, is the director, and the board, maybe the president of the board is somewhere between as well, but if we have questions or concern, we run it through somebody versus just this kind of wide open situation where we're getting billed for every minute of it. I mean, that's no ding on BB&K. If you're working and you're interacting, hey, nobody works for free. But I think that's something we as a board need to figure out and have a discussion on going forward, because while this particular situation is running down, and hopefully we're all going to do our best to avoid anything close to this, I think we need to have some better practices in place to minimize that in the future.
Thank you, Jason. I agree with that. And I'd like to start by saying that I think BB&K is doing an excellent job for us in terms of their services, and in terms of the breadth of attorneys that they have to help us with a variety of issues. And I've looked at their bills, the detail of their bills, and can tell you, as I'm sure you can as well, that how they bill us is appropriate. But it's the amount that really is the issue here. The amount of hours, the amount of issues that have come at us, something like a fire hose of litigation. We've paid an immense amount of money on Public Record Act requests, for example. And this is something that we normally don't get. We must have 20 or 30 times as many PRAs this year as we had the year before. So when you see the sleepy little number that we put on our legal fees each year, that's, in terms of the budget, that's what we've been dealing with these last years. So this is a lot like getting hit by a bus, from a legal metaphor. And I think there are ways that we can see this coming better next time. And there are methods that we can put in place right now, but they have to be a 3-way team effort. It has to come from the board, it has to come from staff, and it has to come from our legal vendor, BB&K. And I think there are some suggestions that we can make tonight, or some focus groups or some sessions where, from a management point of view, we can get together with the folks involved and start talking about things like single source requests for legal bills or for legal work. It's some way to funnel what we all want to a single person who's a gatekeeper on that, and then can order services appropriately. We should have a dinger on our bill every month, that someone from BB&K calls us, or we determine somehow when we've hit our $10,000 for the month limit. And if we've hit that, it spreads like wildfire through the rest of us, and we stop as much as we can consuming legal services. I believe that we're going to get to a point in the very near future where we're at a steady state of legal bills that's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000. And the amount that we've set aside for that and the adjustments that we've made mathematically makes sense for that to happen. But the minute we get hit again with another lawsuit or with another flurry, a big flurry of Public Record Act requests and so on, then we get to be in trouble. So that's why these items to monitor what we're spending on our legal bill should be instituted right away. I think they've been being done by folks individually, but not, in my mind, have they been done collectively, where all of us are part of this, part of the solution, and we help the management, or help to manage it. So that would be my comment on what we're seeing and what we can do about it.
So Terry, am I correct in understanding that you're imagining a world going forward where we would be spending on average $10,000 a month on legal counsel? Is that?
That's going to be basically our budget going forward, at least till the end of this fiscal year.
Okay, so just with some rough, that's an awful lot of money.
It is,
do you think
right.
that what comprises that estimation?
It is, that estimate for me is the wind down plateau that we seem to be approaching. It could easily go a lot lower than that if we don't have, if we cut out things like in-person representation at meetings with travel time and all that, although that comparatively is a small amount to the other things that we've been paying, the litigation phase of what we've been through is over now. And we've mopped up some of the settlement items, or the agreement items as well. We still have PRA requests that we're processing. In fact, that took a big hunk of the last bill that we got for that matter. But these things will, and I hate to say hopefully, because hope is never a plan, but I do believe that this will settle down to the point where we'll have a much lower bill. 10,000, you're right, Katie, that's a lot per month. I believe it's going to be something less than that, but we can afford up to that much between now and the end of the year. Under the plan that we have now that we're about to ratify.
Right. Okay, let me come at this from a slightly different angle. So in looking at the bills that we've gotten, litigation aside, right? Because obviously it's a special circumstance. Like Jason said, we're going to try real hard not to get sued again or make mistakes that lead to litigation. So that's sort of a separate category in some ways. But apart from regular, legal representation, regular counsel on various things, the huge majority of what we're looking at in terms of costs, like the largest line item if we did it that way, is PRAs, right?
Well, it depends on which of the matters you're looking at.
Right.
But and on the
I mean, like going forward.
right.
Right. So going forward, if things continue in the same way, like you're saying, you're projecting, is it correct to say that the large majority of that 10,000 per month you're estimating will be spent on the cost of handling PRAs?
Yes.
Okay. What can we do on our end, and maybe this is a Cindy question or a process question or council question, what can we do on our end to keep our costs down while, of course, understanding that anybody at any time has the absolute right to make as many requests as they would like for public records, that we're a public agency, that anybody has the right to request or see anything that they would like that's compliant. That being said, what can we do to keep our costs down on that front, if anything?
Before I answer that question, I would like to add one thing, and that's one thing that I'm doing as interim director is I'm looking at your policies and procedures, and oftentimes it requires advice, legal advice. For instance, not too long ago we were installing security cameras. Well, my first question was, can we do that? What are our legal limitations? What's our retention rate? So I just want to make sure that it is more than public records requests that I would be looking to BB&K for. The other thing that I understand that they have is a contracts department. So, if we're going to write RFPs for architects, or we're going to request, whatever it is that we want, that's an incredible resource. When I worked in my former agency, I had an attorney that was assigned to my department, and I would say that we spent probably a quarter of his time on libraries specifically. Granted, it was a larger organization. So even though 10,000 sounds like a lot in the grand scheme of things, I think it's well worth it for what you're saying we mainly have to deal with in terms of public requests, but also in terms of advice. Now back to your question.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand why in the past, and maybe the answer, right, maybe the answer is we weren't operating in a way that was a best practice or that would be advisable. But how come in the past we were able to operate with this sort of monthly budget of, what was it, like $2 and a quarter, $1,000 a month for legal costs, when presumably we had all the same issues, right, about like contracts and RFPs and regular operating expense. So was it the case that maybe we just weren't doing those things, or we weren't clearing them with legal counsel, or we didn't? I guess I'm trying to understand why these numbers are so vastly different. And is it just PRAs? Is it operating procedures? Like, what represents the bulk of that differential?
I mean, we are just estimating the 10,000, but once again, my very initial review of policies, there wasn't a lot of, I think that there probably wasn't as much legal review as we should have had. And I don't know how much, whatever I'm going to do between now and the time I leave, how much of legal's time will be required, but I do know that I will need it. And then you add the public records requests that seem to be continuing. I think it's a small price to pay. And maybe once you get through this interim period and you get a new director and, you know, all your policies are approved by the board and they're vetted through the legal process, or through legal advice, then it won't be $10,000. But at this point, I do think it's a good investment.
Me too.
I think to answer your question, it's a lot of factors. If you go back, I mean, we didn't get public records requests, so it's like one a year. There was one contact to legal, which was the director, and the board and inspector worked together when there was legal issues.
You can't hear.
Sorry. So, basically.
Just to answer your question, I think it's a lot of different factors going into why the amount is so different now. That's just my experience. We didn't get public records requests. There was one point of contact to legal counsel. So, yeah.
And then definitely policy, you know, we need to update them. and
Oh,
that
no,
wasn't
I,
done.
I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I just want to understand the contours of why there's such a big gap.
I would also agree on our bidding process. You know, we're not a large enough agency to pay for highly skilled professionals who know how to do this without going to an attorney. So when it comes to these RFPs and all this stuff that could come up, especially when we're talking ADA, I think we do need to do that. I think the one thing that we can easily do, and I think I would ask the rest of the board for feedback, and I don't believe this is a motion, I think we can just make this as a request to our director, is to go return to the one point of contact. I don't see any reason why any one of us, if we feel that we have a question that needs legal, if we're gonna be paying legal to be at this meeting, if it can wait until this meeting. If it's that much of an emergency, we have a director in place and we can email those questions. I would just make that a formal request that we just simply return to that and make that request to our legal who's present tonight and our director, and ask that we as board members just commit to that. If we have questions, we can wait till the board meeting, or we can, Cindy, I think at least that's something immediate that can start reining in some costs.
I think we can do that.
That makes sense. I'd just like to comment that another category of legal advice that we have needed a lot in the past, well, since I've been around and will need is employment. And I think if this board had legal advice in that area a long time ago, we could have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars that we spent on legal fees. So, sometimes you're spending money in order to save money down the road. Can I just take another moment? Because I just want to dispel the narrative that I have heard floating around, and I've heard again tonight, that this board, the only ones of which who are still around that were on the board when we voted to hire BB&K, there's a false narrative that we rejected staff recommendation. That is not true. I went back and watched the video again twice. I have the matrix of the Excel spreadsheet that Ryan Roy painstakingly prepared that gave us 3 top choices, and he said any one of them would be a good choice. Dale Gronemeyer said any one of them would be a good choice. And the only thing that Ryan said that put one firm, as he put it, might have edged them out or in slightly was that one attorney, their labor attorney, happened to be working out of San Diego, and if there was any reason why we needed an employment attorney to appear at a meeting, that might make it a little bit difficult. Ryan never recommended one firm over another for any substantive reason, and so we did use the expertise of the one attorney we had on our board at the time who offered reasons why he felt that BB&K would be a good choice. So I'm disappointed to hear that history get revised. I think our staff did an amazing job of giving us a really clear set of criteria from which to choose. I think we used best judgment at the time, and I think we made a good choice.
And I'm probably the only one who was on the board before the new trustees have come on. And it has been a difficult situation at best. Some had to do with employment, you're absolutely right. And I would not object to having the interim director to have one person, even if that person had to come to a meeting for whatever reason. Maybe $10,000 does seem extreme, but at the same time, in some instances, we did not get good representation. And I think we need to be clear about that early on. And so some can sit here and sort of snicker at that. But if we had gotten some good advice in the beginning, maybe some things might not have been as they are. So yes, we are spending some money, and I think we need to protect the library at all ends, whatever that cost is at this point.
So I think we're all in agreement that a procedural change needs to be made, even as our costs are winding down now, to have a one-source gatekeeper, if you will, for how our legal services are ordered and consumed, to have a better dialogue with BB&K when we meet certain minimum thresholds each month, that they could give us a real-time estimate of how our legal costs are going, and we can react to that the gatekeeper can react to that, etc. These are just ideas that I'm throwing out there, and I think when we get down to a motion or resolution about this, it would be something that has to do with staff, maybe working with a board trustee or two, and also BB&K getting together and figure out some best practices for us, just for us as a library, to control the spending. So a motion like that, something less wordy perhaps, would be appreciated, and I think that might do the trick for this agenda item.
So you want to set up a working group, is that what I'm understanding? Or you want to put in place some procedural changes now? Or I guess I'm not clear about what the next steps are that you're recommending or that you're advocating.
My personal feeling is that this would take some thought, and that getting together in a small group, a working group, if you will, whatever it might be, just to kick around a couple of ideas and turn this over to the director for a set of policies that would allow a better pipeline, if you will, of legal services and how we're using them. So it's my idea. I'm open to others, but that's.
So I think we've got a lot of committees right now, but I do want to recognize that we also have an interim director with who can't work 80 hours a week like some of us do. So I also don't want to keep asking the director to produce all this stuff, knowing that we've already reviewed stuff on today's agenda where we haven't spent money, we've missed opportunities because of our staffing situation. I know we still need to get to that piece of the agenda as well. So I guess I would ask, in an ideal situation, I think we would just ask the director, hey, the next meeting or 2 meetings from now, bring us some recommendations, we vote them up or down, and we move forward. I think we've made some clear ideas from the board knows. I guess, how much of a burden do we think it's reasonable to say, hey, can you just bring a couple bullet point recommendations to go up or down to the next meeting?
Not unreasonable at all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is the board, are you cool
That'd
with
be
that?
great.
Let's do that.
That's great. Thank
I
you.
didn't quite hear that.
So what I'm saying is we would just ask the director to bring some bullet point ideas to the next meeting for us to vote up or down on this issue. I think we've provided a lot of input already. as to what we would like to see, and I think that's the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to move forward.
And we will have received some more bills by then, and we'll see if this is a real or an imaginary threat that we're facing. The $10,000 that I mentioned wasn't my saying that we should consume that much in legal fees. It's how much we've budgeted. And if we can save from that line item, so much the better for the situation that we're in now.
Yeah, and I think I understand that.
Okay.
It's protection.
Cool.
So we don't need a vote for that, right?
There was a motion. If you're directing staff, there was a motion.
Oh,
This is the consensus of the board.
It's a consensus.
So a motion then to, okay, let's just do that. We can have a motion to have the director bring back ideas at the next meeting.
So I'll go ahead and make the motion that the board is requesting the director to bring recommendations to the next regularly scheduled board meeting on ways that we could attempt to curtail our legal costs.
I'll second that.
All in favor, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, next item is, and I should ask the room, as we've been an hour and 45 minutes into this meeting, would we like to take a break, a recess of 10 minutes? Okay, we're going to take a recess for 10 minutes and we'll reconvene at about 6:55. Okay, I think people are mostly back, so we'll get started a little early here, back in session at 6:53. And we're on item 4C, and we have another public comment on that item 4C.
Yes, thank you. Special District Leadership Academy. In the past, the library director frequently urged and encouraged board members to get training as to how to be better and more effective and efficient board members for this library district through a variety of programs, including this one before you now. Obviously, I'm going to urge that everyone take advantage of these learning opportunities to become better board members and better understand the role, the important and special role of board members in a special district. That said, oh, and I should point out that at the time, the former library director was given a lot of grief for pointing out that board members might need training, that somehow once elected, these individuals gained knowledge that other humans simply didn't possess. And I remember a board member specifically stating that this sort of training was too expensive for members of the board because it was a kind of a waste of taxpayers' money to go off and get intensive training. And we heard earlier from someone up there on the board about spending money now rather than spending money in the future. Perhaps had the past board had some of this training, they would have better understood that role. So I would urge you to take advantage of this training, but not just that available from the Special Districts Association. There are other organizations, such as library organizations, such as the California Library Association and their special districts subgroup. You are not just a special district, you are a library district. And as we've heard, fire companies and utility companies, water companies, all kinds of places are special districts. They are not libraries. And you need to know about how a library needs to function so that instead of spending the annual equivalent of the salary of the library director on legal bills, which has got to look good to staff members who are paid much less than that, who wish they could make $10,000 a month. You spend that money, or most of that, on actually providing services to the members of the public and the community this library district is intended to serve. So please, as I have requested of this board, the board of this agency in prior years, please spend this money, get this and additional training, because you're human, you need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, let's begin discussion on this item. Katie?
Yeah, so I wanted to throw this out there for a couple of reasons. One, I know some of us have done CSDA training in the past, and I recently had the opportunity to do some of it, and I just can't recommend highly enough that we take advantage of this. It's already in our budget. We've got the money to do it. There's also, as you'll see in the packet, an opportunity to apply for some scholarship money from the Special District Leadership Foundation, which would reimburse the district for the tuition of somebody attending, possibly more than one trustee. And I can tell you from having talked to the SDLF folks that they are beating the bushes for people to apply for that money. It's sitting there and they want to give it out, so I think that we should take them up on that. One very cool thing about the SDLA is that there is a discount for subsequent board members attending. So if one of us goes, the tuition is $600, and for each additional person that goes, there's a $200 price break. So it incentivizes additional attendees. I am definitely planning on going. I got my scholarship form filled out. But I think it's really cool, and I just want to kind of put in a personal testimonial for the value of what CSDA does and how helpful it is to hear about what they've got to tell us.
Just to clarify, where the funding would come from is meetings and travel? Is that where it would come from? 6710?
Yeah, well, we do have, let's see.
Or
66
training and education?
Am I on?
But that's the
6625 is, sorry.
Well, 6623 says trustee professional development, but that doesn't have any money in it.
Right, and so what we thought, if you all agreed with this, is that we could take some of the money that's in the 6625 and put it into the trustee professional development, because we've not spent even half of our training budget. Or we can leave it there and just charge it to that account.
The library has one of these in the spring, doesn't it? Is that, I was trying to remember that there was one that I attended. Was it, yeah, was it in the spring or was it in the fall? Oh, okay. Couldn't recall it. So you can move some money, we would need to move that money. We have to motion that.
Couple of things. I believed, and I told Terry and Cindy that the board would vote, if a trustee wanted to attend a conference like this, the board would vote for that trustee or vote on approving any trustee that wanted to go, basically. I don't know if it's in the bylaws, but I want to say that that's how it's supposed to be done. There's discussion and then the vote to approve the board member attending, so the library would pay for it. Nicole, maybe you can answer. There's a few different line items, so like if they were reimbursed for mileage, that's one item.
Which one?
Hotel would be another one, and then like training would be, I think, the conference itself, but I would definitely recommend applying to the Leadership Foundation. My first board clerk conference was paid for with a scholarship from the foundation, and yeah, I mean, all of their trainings, I think, are very valuable. But again, I think just this item on the agenda is that the board can kind of discuss, you know, Katie already intends to go. I think, though, that the board should vote, you know.
Well, is there any more discussion about this then?
Well, I'm considering going, but I'm not certain whether my schedule is going to permit it, but I've looked at it and tentatively scheduled.
Can I just ask you a question? If all you decide to go, would that be a Brown Act thing?
Nope.
No.
No.
As long as we don't talk about library stuff.
Yeah.
Can I just say, for the April session, the early bird discount is March 8th. It doesn't, I'm not seeing a firm deadline after that to be able to apply to go, so it looks like it would be possible for, if you're not ready to commit tonight, and I'm not either, because of scheduling, that there still could be an opportunity to make a decision about other board members' attendance at the March meeting. I would also like to say, kind of to Renee's point, this does look fabulous. I would be really interested as a librarian to look at what might make sense for me to do at the Library Association. And if different ones of us go to different training opportunities, then we come back and share what we've learned with each other. So that's another idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
All right, so we need a motion to approve this course for you, Katie, and I think just you're not suggesting that we have 3 slots that we want to do, okay. So, need a motion for that approval?
Motion to approve?
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Right, bon voyage, Katie, that's great.
Bring your newspaper.
All right, now we're on to item 4D, team librarian job description. Mr. Amy has a comment on this one.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure there's a reason this is coming before you, probably as an update from some massive failing. As we all know, this position is now vacant. It hasn't been flown, like some other positions, including the collection development manager. We've heard about the issues that these lack of filled positions are causing for the library district. I mean, we've been missing a collection development manager for, 6 months, 7 months now. So that could be a challenge. Hopefully we'll see a collection development manager position flown sometime soon. But the real reason I'm up here, if this is a modified and revised and updated and legal counsel has weighed in, there are problems. And that is, and it's hard for me to say this because it sounds so repetitive, but let me thump the lectern and tear my hair. There's a little thing called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you cannot discriminate against an employee, a potential employee, in the hiring process if they have a disability. Now, you have a facility that is not ADA compliant. You hire somebody in a wheelchair, maybe I've missed it, and I may have, but how are they going to go to the bathroom? Now, you might want to tell someone who's highly qualified that they can't have the job because they're disabled. You might want to be able to say that. But you've just been talking about the issues related to lawsuits and the costs and the need to keep legal fees down. Patently, you're going to have to discriminate against an otherwise qualified. You don't even mention in here the need or the ability. There's this thing about reasonable accommodation with reasonable accommodation, ability to do this or that with reasonable accommodation. You don't even mention that. Now, maybe I'm missing something. Sometimes I do. But it infuriates me that this many years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, you folks are set to patently violate the law and discriminate against individuals with disabilities. And I don't know how you feel about that, but it makes me as a constituent, a taxpayer, all the rest of those lovely things, really concerned.
Renee, they fixed the bathroom downstairs for people with disabilities. I can attest to that.
That's great, but how are you going to get there in a wheelchair?
Okay,
So,
please,
but I don't mean to
please,
engage
let's get
with
some
another.
order back into the
So
room, okay?
thank you very much.
Okay, with that, let's go on to the teen librarian job description. And Cindy, I think you want to talk about that?
Yeah, in your packet is a bulletin, a job description for the teen librarian. This person, in addition to all the standard duties of a librarian, selection and customer service, would also be specifically focused on teen services. And this is as a result of the resignation of Kate Shoemaker. This is also part of what I'm going to be talking about later, a reorganization. This position was a librarian too, and it was a department upon itself. And I'm recommending that we make it a librarian 1 position under adult services so that the teen librarian and the adult services manager can work as a team. The teen librarian would also be asked as needed to represent adult services. And I think that merging of the two distinct positions would be really useful for the library organization. The recruitment period would be, we would post this on our website, we would post it in CALEX, which is California Library Association, and then a couple of other professional websites for 2 weeks. And this is, as you know, a critical position, and we hope to post it as soon as possible.
So can I just ask a question? So having joined the ALA some time ago, I now get their routine updates. So their entire last magazine was almost solely dedicated to within the professional librarian world, this question of the relevance of a master's in library sciences. Not being part of that professional world and seeing that that's a requirement on this, I'm just, what is our thinking behind that? I mean, I think it's a no-brainer for director level, but just thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the standard for any librarian position and above has been a master's degree, so I think that there are specialized skills that you bring. Most librarians don't have an undergraduate degree in library science per se. They have other disciplines that they've specialized in, and so the master's degree allows for some specialization.
I have a question about I just looked at the org chart because of the comment that you just made, and I'm noticing that the way, and we'll talk about this later, I know, but the way that this is laid out, the librarian 1, teen librarian reports to the adult services librarian, and then 2 library associates report to the teen librarian?
That's the way it's marked on there. No, it would, they would report directly
To the adults, that's what I kind of thought made more sense. Okay, thank you.
And I just had a quick question about the line that says, previous experience working in a library is preferred, but not required. And I know you've done a lot of hiring library folks. How does that working out for you? Is that something that you could do without the fact that you haven't worked in a library?
Yeah, I mean, this is considered at the librarian 1 level, it would be considered entry level, so you could get this job right out of library, out of graduate school. Of course, there are a lot of people out there that are looking for work and that have had experience, so, you know, you might give preference to somebody that has a little more experience.
Thanks. Is that all the discussion then on this? And then I'd look for a motion for approval on this then.
So moved.
I'd second it.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve this job description, position. Can I get a vote now? All in favor, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion carries. Now we're on to the consent calendar, and I've taken a...
You've got 4 E.
Oh, I'm so sorry, yeah. We're on to 4E then. I don't see any requests for comment on this one, okay? Let's launch right into that. And again, Cindy, you're on for a description of this one.
All right, I think we can all agree that the staff has had a difficult year, maybe a little more than a year. They're on their 4th director and, or interim director, 3rd interim director. And I think I've been having one-on-ones with everyone, and I think they need the opportunity opportunity to do some team building. And so I'm recommending that we engage a facilitator for a one-day staff retreat, so to speak, to have time to kind of consider what's happened, but most importantly, to move forward. And so I'm suggesting that we close the library, and I always hate to close libraries, but I do think this is really important, on Tuesday, April 23rd. And that date, I've come up with that date because I also would like to suggest that we hire a very well-known library facilitator whose name is Cheryl Gould. She offers an array of many different workshops that libraries take advantage of. I've talked to her briefly and told her, my assessment of where we are with the staff, and I think she would be the most qualified person to do this workshop. And she's only available on April 23rd. She was also available in March, but I felt that was too soon to move forward, especially because the week she was available, the school district was closed for spring break. So her cost is $2,700, which I think is a good price, a fair price. She comes from up north. She's reducing her fee a little bit because she has another commitment in Ontario. So with that, I ask for your approval for a closure on April 23rd.
What is her name, her last name? I didn't hear it.
Yeah, sorry, Cheryl Gould, Gould.
Okay.
And I used her a couple times in my previous position, and the staff really, of all the consultants we ever worked with, she was probably the most beneficial.
There's money in the budget for that, right?
Yeah, under
Okay.
training.
Under training.
Or, no, I'm sorry, under consultants.
Okay. I don't.
That's on a Tuesday then, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess my only question, I'm not familiar with this sort of thing, is that, closing the library, all of the protocol for this has been worked out in terms of noticing and canceling or moving programs around and so on?
Yeah, we've checked our schedule, and other than regularly scheduled, there's no special program that's scheduled that day. So, with your approval, then that would give us enough notice, 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks with the loan period and consideration. This would be ideal in terms of giving people notification.
All right, if discussion's over, can I get a motion for the
I'd offer that
approval?
motion that we approve the staff training on April 23rd at a cost of $2,700.
Aren't we just approving the closure?
And the closure
Do we
of
need
the
to
building.
approve the funds?
No.
So
Okay.
we're just approving the closure?
And we're approving just the closure?
Yes.
The closure of the building on the 23rd.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the closure for that day for the staff training. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Now we are at the consent calendar, and I apologize for the kind of wacky place this lands on the agenda. I kind of mixed that one tonight. But is there anyone that wants to remove an item from the consent calendar for later? Okay, so can I get a motion then to approve the consent calendar?
So moved. Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. All right, now we're on to, and forgive me if I'm missing another vote for, okay, this after item, let me see. We're on to reports, item number 7, and it looks like we do have another request for comment on this. Mr. Amy?
Thank you. I'm not sure this is the best point to bring this up, but, and maybe it's later, I don't know. But I wanted to bring up the point that there seems to be some confusion in the community as to the role and length of role for the interim director. And that is that a highly influential member of the public has suggested that it will take at least a year for a new director to be put in place, to be found and put in place. The challenge we all face, of course, is Ms. Cleary can't work for the ALD for more than 1,000 hours, or she'll lose her pension. And I don't think she's going to want to do that. So I hope that this board will have an opportunity to dispel that misapprehension, I suppose, within the community that it could take longer than the time available, and that this board is actually monitoring very closely how many hours Ms. Cleary spends basically per week working. Because if you suddenly lined up with Ms. Cleary because you folks have said, well, we need this done and we need that, and suddenly she's doing 80-hour weeks, we could come up exceedingly short and have a really significant problem thereof. So please, if you can get your lawyers to let you know, probably for a little cost, that they're running that bill up, maybe you need to monitor just exactly the hourly amount of time she's spending on projects, because that will bite us big time. Additionally, in all of this, I had an opportunity, because this is part of this, the org chart. I'm honestly confused because it indicates that you're looking for, going to need a curriculum development person, and I don't see it. It's over in the side box, and some of those items that are in that side box have colored slots for them in the org chart as missing persons, so to speak. And the one that's not there in that new org chart is anything listed as a collection development manager. So I think it would behoove this district and the board to try and figure that out as part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, with that, we will hear the district director's report.
Well, under Library General Operations, I had more of a report, and I've talked a lot about it already as to what I've been up to for the last 3 weeks. First of all, I'm very pleased to be part of the Altadena community and the library district in particular. So it's been a learning curve. I've been having one-on-one meetings with our staff to introduce myself, but also hear what they need from me in the coming months while I'm here. I've met with the presidents of the foundation and the friends, participated in trustee committee meetings. I attended a couple of great programs. Second Saturday, over 200 people. I'm really impressed with the wide array of programming that's happening here. African Drum Circle, that was wonderful. I think in terms of programming, I think the next step, I was part of the programming committee, and I think the next step is for the programming committee to really look at the community conversation outcomes, because we haven't really met all of the expectations of the community, so we'll be doing that in the next coming months. As you know, we're going to talk about the organization chart. I began review of job descriptions. There needs to be some consistency across classifications, and it doesn't appear that some of the job classifications and bulletins have been brought to the board's attention for approval, so we'll make sure that everything is in order and that you have approved everything pending our review of the job descriptions. I mentioned earlier we will be reviewing policies. There are a lot of outdated policies, but it feels like there's some missing policies as well, and there really is not one centralized policy manual for me to refer to, so I've been gathering those over the last couple weeks. And then we're also reviewing, Stella and the team have been reviewing evaluation forms for staff, and we'll be bringing an evaluation form for your review to the next meeting. It appears that people have not been evaluated on a yearly basis for quite some time, so we're gathering that information as well. That should be standard operating procedure, but it has not been, so that will be a focus of my energy also in the next couple months, probably next month, because it is a very high priority for me. In terms of the organization chart, we had an organization chart, but there was, because of all the changes in staffing, there was some confusion about who was doing what and who was reporting to whom. So I do want to make it clear this does not in any way impact or change my relationship with the board. This is purely an operational change, and a lot of it isn't a change, it's just more a clarification. So if you look at it, under the director would be the finance department, passport services, IT, the public services director, building services and security, and marketing and volunteer coordinator. I see the public services director, which currently is Stella, as overseeing the operations of the organization. And that would include, you know, the true public services, the circulation, adult services, children's family services, the branch, technical services, and the thinking being, you have a unified desk that happened in the renovation, and there are a lot of kinks to work out with that. So right now we're separating circulation, people that check out books and process books, from the adult services staff. So you see a lot of people under circulation, but a lot of those people do programming right now. So Stella and I will be working with Katie in adult services to determine which of those people under circulation will go over to adult services. For right now, Estella, public services director, will be supervising the people in circulation until we work all that out. So that'll be changing a bit. There was a librarian too whose job really hadn't been defined, and so we have put that person under technical services, which includes cataloging of books, the processing of outsourced catalog books, and acquisitions, buying of books. And so that person will take some of the responsibility that was with the collection manager. The higher level collection service or collection operations can stay with the public services director for the time being. And then, as I said, some of the responsibility of collection development manager will go to the librarian too, that's now in charge of technical services. We did lose Felipe, as of the 28th of February. Felipe Villa will be leaving us. He is retiring. He was the building supervisor, which is that blacked out or oranged out box that you see. So for now, the person, Jonathan, who was actually hired to manage the renovation, will assume supervision of the custodial and gardening crews at this time. The box that was referred to earlier, current vacancies, yeah, you have a permanent director vacancy, obviously. We will be moving forward with the page hiring, and we have a bulletin ready to, or did we already post for that? We're about to post for that, and the teen librarian, obviously, we're going to post for that. I'm going to hold off on posting for the building supervisor, because I'm not convinced at this point that we need that position, since, as I said, Jonathan had been hired to be in charge of the renovation, and we're done until we move forward with other things. So I'd like to hold that one in abeyance for the time being. The collection development manager, as I say, we've distributed those responsibilities between the public services director and the librarian too, and technical services. And I think there should be more of an assessment about other needs in the library, especially related to public services, perhaps more staff in adult services, perhaps more staff in children's services in particular. My observation is they're understaffed in terms of the amount of programming that they like to do. The other thing that I think we need more of in public services is the ability to really go out in the community and do much more outreach. So my point being is I'd like to hold the collection development manager and building supervisor positions open for now, and I in fairness to a new director, I think it would be good to leave them open for a while so a new director could come in and really assess again what I've already assessed. I have talked to Stella, obviously, and she thinks she can manage, the collection development side as also part of her public services director position. So, that's a long-winded way of saying, I think this will help bring clarity to roles and responsibilities and lines of supervision.
That is a typo on the current vacancies, the teen librarian, it should say librarian 1.
questions, but I have a comment. I think you're really digging in, and I really appreciate that. A little shout out to Stella too during as we make this transition. And it's really nice to see Stella assisting you to the degree she is, and all of the things that you have to deal with the staff and so on. And a shout out to the staff. They're here, a few of them here. I think they're doing a terrific job under, it's been a long slog here for everybody. So this is welcome, and I really appreciate the updates. And I don't think we need any action on this, right? We're done with this discussion. We're moving on now to item 7D. And Renee, do I have this right that you'd like to speak
Yes.
out of this item?
Yes, please.
I have to spoke on 7 in general.
Okay.
Not one line item. Oh, you go ahead, never mind. It's your decision, Terry.
I would suggest you can't lump 47 things together and limit public comment when they're disparate as they are here. So if you list it on and you're going to take action or whatever, then you need to allow public comment on it. You can't have this huge range of things and omnibus.
I'm not getting what you're saying, Renee.
I'll make my comment.
Okay.
So thank you. And that is, you've got a lot going on here. You've got a lot of plans. You've got a lot of committees and all the rest of that sort of stuff. You're also planning, again, obviously, to hire a new director. A year and a half ago, I don't know when it was, offered $1,000 towards the hiring of an individual or group to do a library management audit that would go through and provide a full report as to how well and how the board interacts with library management. I'd like to humbly suggest that not only is it time for that still yet again, outside experts to come in and assess the situation, but to look at the overall structure and management of the library as it stands, so that as you go to hire an individual, you don't just say, well, what are you going to do for our lovely little library? And they get to say, well, we're going to bring unicorns and pink pansies and twinkly toes. And you can say, well, that sounds like the best thing ever. Whether or not you know that you need it, an individual or group that comes in and does such an assessment, similar to the curriculum management audit that was done 17 years ago for the Pasadena Unified School District, allows an incoming potential candidate to have a full independent understanding of the challenges facing the Altadena Library District. They can then, as they come in, say, well, this is what I'm going to do, and then when on a yearly basis, you have a management tool to fully and properly assess their performance. Typically what happens then in a school district is a director will have one of those commissioned, such a curriculum management audit, as they come in, and then as they go out, so they can definitively show the progress they've made. It's an advantage not only to the library to have such a thing in terms of hiring someone, but then it turns out to be of benefit to the individual who is hired, because then they have benchmarks they've met, they can demonstrate to future employees. You're likely to attract better candidates, in a word. Now, a year and a half ago, I offered $1,000 towards that. Sadly, that money out of my pocket is gone. But you folks are apparently flush with cash. So I would again encourage you, thanks to rising property taxes and the like, I would again encourage you to properly plan ahead of falling off a cliff, okay? The cost of this wouldn't be all that great, and it would be of great benefit, again, in the idea of selecting someone for the future. Also, because you folks are looking to hire consultants from various and sundry agencies, remember that this isn't just a special district, as I pointed out earlier. This is a library district. It's a different critter, so expect that the consultant fees that you're going to have to pay are going to be higher. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I may have inadvertently got us out of order here, and I apologize for that. I was trying to jump ahead, I believe, to item 7D, and I went right past item 7B. So I don't see anybody who needs to speak. Oh, I'm sorry, Randy has put in a request to speak ahead of item 7B. So if someone could hand her a microphone, that would be terrific. And with this, I'm closing everybody in the interest of time, any more speaker
Okay.
requests.
So, I only have one question or comment or request. The answering service that you guys use, can you please get rid of it? Because when you call the library, those people don't know, like, I called the other day to talk about Lucas, and they said, what department? Have a nice day. And they don't know us, I don't know where they live, but I just think it's a waste of money. Because when you call, if someone answers the phone, I know they're all understaffed now, but eventually we'll be regular staff. The people who answer the phone, we know them, they know us, they can answer our questions. These people, they just, it's not a good thing. That was it.
Okay, thank you, Granny. Okay, you're on, Nicole.
Okay, so for December 2018, this is the first time that the financial statements have shown a net excess due to the receipt of our first property tax installment from the county in the amount of almost $2.7 million, so that's very good. The district currently has a little over $3 million in cash and cash equivalents. Net income for December is about $1.5 million. Printing revenue and rental income are still exceeding budget expectations at 77% and 145% of budget. From support groups in December, the library received donations from both the Friends and the Foundation in the amounts of $11,000 and $5,000, which is also very exciting. And then for expenditure highlights, we have in December paid legal fees for October and November totaling $56,000 and putting us at 842% of budget. And then we did review any expenditures that varied greatly at the mid-year and seen the findings.
So that was quick. I mentioned there might be some questions on this. Or maybe not. I think we're gonna, yeah, go ahead.
I think we pretty much, no, sorry. I was just saying, I think we pretty much covered it during the budget adjustment. I think most of my questions are going to be about that.
Yeah. So when I said it's quick, I meant it was a compliment, Nicole, just to let you know.
I did have one question. You talked a lot about the copy machines and all before. How is it that we're getting revenue from printing?
So we charge, rental income, that's not the machines. The rental income is from renting our parking lot.
No, I know, but printing revenue, you mean like the quarters that people have put in the book? Wow, okay.
Yes, we do a huge volume of printing, which is why we kind of retooled the lease.
Okay.
Oh, well, almost outside.
I used it for the first time today. It's super awesome. It was really cool. Yeah. It gives you back quarters. Gives you a lot.
Okay, do we need a vote here? Do you accept and receive the,
Yeah, I mean, we had discussion on this. In the past, it was receive and file, and there was not a vote, and then somewhere in between, the board started voting to receive and file, so.
I say just receive and file. Gotta get a vote on that?
I don't think you need
Okay.
to vote.
It's in the posted agenda, so we don't.
Not necessary.
All right, that brings us to item 7D, which will be the reports of the committees. And this is going to be complex. We tried to put this in the most flexible format possible. Kylie and I talked about this. So there's discussion and possible action on each one of these committees, because I'm not sure all of them are going to require an action item. So with that, I'd like to start with number 1, which is the bylaws committee report.
But wait a minute. Am I missing something? Weren't we supposed to do something with this mid? What? Oh, my God. I thought we were supposed to do something with the budget as to whether we're going to approve it.
That's after this section.
Oh, excuse me then. Okay, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Okay.
So I think you're up actually with bylaws,
Thank you so much.
page 87.
Okay, well, let's do this. Eyes on. It's on.
No, it's red. I think it means it's the battery's dead.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful then. Okay. this is just an update on the bylaws committee. Our task was to update the policies and practices of the Altadena Library District Board of Trustees for the current year. And really, to tell you the truth, the last revisions were done in 2006. So we have met twice, February the 4th and also February 12th. At the meeting on February the 4th, and I'm not reading this entire report to you, Trustee McMullins and Clark were in attendance, and also our interim director, Cindy, was there, Estella was there, and Kylan. One of the things that we did at that time was that we looked at 3 different things. We looked at the bylaws from 2006. We looked at the changes that we had made last year, and also the policies and procedures that are in place with the Palos Verdes. And we want to thank, actually we're not calling them bylaws, we're calling them now board policies or governing policies. And I want to thank Katie, because what she did is that she merged all 3 of those. And that was quite a challenge into the Palos Verdes format that they have. And then she shared that with us at the February 12th meeting, and then we went through some of that and looked at it. Again, we were there, she and I, as well as Sydney, Stella, and Kylan. And she shared those changes that she had made, and we looked at them closely, line by line, and that was really good. So she could tell us where she pulled different things from, which one of those documents she pulled them from. And then we decided at that meeting on that we would perform a close reading of the new draft, and then we talked about discussions and edits that needed to be made, so that we would be able to prepare this whole document and have it ready for the March meeting. Now we have 2 meetings left. They're on February the 27th and the 28th. We're going to try to keep them brief, but we'll be meeting from 9 a.m. until 11 o'clock in the director's office again. And we hope to have them ready so that by March the 4th, we can send those documents to and get some legal counsel on them, so that we're doing things correctly and that we're not missing some items. And then we want to have that in March. We want to we want them in the packet so that the community can give comments on them. And then our hope is that by April, the April meeting, we will be able to have the final discussion, approval, and adoption of the bylaws. Not bylaws, but policies and procedures. Are there any questions?
I would just ask, and there's been discussion on this in the past, something this substantial, I would request that we get it earlier than we normally get the board packets. I know we've talked about it in the past, and that's not an issue.
Okay.
Just so we have
We
more than
talked
a
about
weekend
that.
to review.
Yeah, so also one of the ideas, if I may, was the idea that basically we would debut the new policies in March,
Right,
and then everybody would have a full month to look at them.
right.
Right, so that over the course of the month following, before the April meeting, is when we would go in and do any amendments or, changes. So that gives everybody a full month, members of the public have a full month, because you're right, like, it's a lot.
Yes.
And that, it may be that we need at that point a special meeting or, some other kind of discussion process to accommodate that if it doesn't look like it's gonna fit within the confines of a regular meeting. But yeah, we discussed that as a committee because it's important that everybody has a chance, including the board, right, to really review that at length
Right.
and make sure that if there are any questions or, we want to explore the rationale for why things look the way they do, that we can do that with plenty of time.
Thank you for bringing that question. Good question. Anything else? Okay.
No?
All right.
All right. Sounds like there's no action needed on that. Thanks for that description and synopsis of what's happening. The second item here is the Budget Committee. I'm the chair of that. I'll give a brief report on what's happening there. Betsy is a co-member there. I'll read it from the report I turned in, and I'm sorry that it was a little late. We had our first meeting just late last week. The Budget Committee, just a little bit of history, the Board of Trustees Budget Committee has been inactive for quite a while. It was last referenced in an archived agenda on May the 15th, it should be, 2018, and you can check that out. It's on the library website if you're interested. Just kind of breezing through this real quick. It was a meeting that was actually labeled a special meeting, and all of the trustees were invited, and it was to take a look at the new budget for the next fiscal year, which would have been this one, and everybody got a little overview of that and so on. But I feel that this newly appointed committee, which is a two-person committee, but is a standing committee and will be subject to the bylaw or the Brown Act, sort of represents a reintroduction of the board's involvement in the budget process. All of the meetings will be announced and agendas posted 72 hours in advance as per Brown Act requirements, and the meetings will be open to the public so folks can come and make comments as we work our way through the agenda. We will take minutes and we will have them approved in a manner consistent with board policy. And since our next meeting isn't for a while, a few months, I think we've got time to work through that part of things. If it takes a board motion at the next meeting or whatever, I think we can do that. And this again is the handling of the minutes. The committee is meant to be an advisory body to the library director during the annual budget formation, the mid-year adjustment process, and an ongoing evaluation of budget targets and implementation. It's not meant to be in any way a steering committee or a committee that sets policy. That should all fall to the director. We'll schedule meetings 3 to 4 times a year, and those dates will be a little fluid because they'll be dependent upon when the various packets that we need to have our review would be ready. For instance, we would need to wait for the first budget pass to be made so that we could sit down and look at that. And if it's a mid-year review, similar to the way that we did this the other day, we would wait for those documents to be ready and for the people to be aligned and ready to speak about those things. So that we can't schedule the meeting on a specific date yet, but they'll be around the months of April and January and October. Again, we'll function as a steering body only, and all the processes concerning the formation and alteration of the budget shall be administered by the director. And we will make our recommendations to the full board at times, at points in time when board action is needed. And this is an example when a board action is needed to do the next vote, which is the approval of the mid-year adjustment. We would prefer to have this first. We should have put it that way, you're right, Katie. And then we'll get that information in front of you so that you could make a sound judgment on whether you wanted to vote for the item in play. We had our first meeting on 2/21, which was last Thursday, in the director's office, and the rest of this is stuff that we already know, and that is that with Paul Kmark is our last assignment with Platinum Consulting Group, and Nicole, we went through the mid-year budget adjustment, made a few recommendations, and there were some small changes made, and we felt it was important that the board see this pay a lot of attention to it, to understand that we're in sort of a deficit spending mode right now. And we want to make sure that all your questions are answered and you feel comfortable with taking the next step to avoid this big, or to approve this next, avoid's probably the right word, approve this next mid-year budget review. That's my report. Any questions?
Just out of curiosity, where was the, where and when was this meeting on the 21st noticed?
It was noticed 72 hours in advance.
Right, but where?
It was posted on the outside of the library.
Okay, in future, can I request, and this is just like a procedural thing, that it also be noticed on the website? Because I know. Oh, it was?
Yeah, it was on the
Okay.
website. That was a complex day because that was a Monday and it was a holiday. So the only place where we could put the agenda was on the
That's
door on the outside of the library. There was nobody inside. My son did this, so I know it happened.
Oh, no, I totally knew that it happened. I was just curious.
Yeah, that's the procedure that we'll follow. All right, next is the Executive Search Committee, and Bessie chairs that. Oh, do you have a
I
question?
just have a question. Was there no public comment on 7D? Nobody asked to do public comment
No.
on this section?
Well, there was, and that was Renee. He talked about that.
Oh.
Yeah, and that was where I got ahead of myself, basically, and then had to go back to the report.
Okay, it just seemed
Put it
odd.
in the wrong spot.
Okay, well, I also apologize that my report wasn't ready by the time the packet needed to be assembled, and that's just because I was still working on a lot of the context that I had with people that I've been talking to about best practices, which was the charge that was given to our committee at the last meeting. And I did the bulk of this legwork. Terry and I are the committee, and I know he knows there'll be lots of work for him too later. But at this stage of fact finding, I felt like I could do a lot of that legwork because I know he's had his hands full. So you can see from the chart on the front page of the report all of the names of the people that I either spoke to, emailed with, or met with the hope to get ideas about how searches have happened in similar organizations. And I've tried to sort of summarize that in the latter part of the report, and I'll just give you some of the highlights of what I learned. And I'll sort of preface, going through some of these best practices by saying it really seemed to me that that the process of executive search really falls into sort of two stages, which is kind of common, I guess, for any search, and that is the application phase and the interview phase. So, so the actual search committees that were formed in these different organizations pretty much all consisted solely of board members. Occasionally they added a staff person, either a current director or an HR staff person or both, but no special library district search committees that and I talked to 4, I think, had had members of the public on the initial search committee. I was able to speak with 2 community college trustees, one from our own PCC, Jim Osterling, and also, luckily, one of the special library district trustees that I spoke to was also a trustee of Cypress College, I believe, and so I was able to talk to her about the difference between the types of searches that happened with the 2 different organizations that she served. And I've really concluded that the community college model just really isn't analogous for us or as useful to use as a comparison as the special district libraries, which are essentially sister organizations. 7 out of the 13 people that I talked to highly recommended using a search firm. If they didn't use a search firm in their own searches, it's because they usually had an internal candidate that seemed like, the preferred candidate, and it didn't seem necessary to do an extensive search outside of the organization. I have had the estimate. This came from Robert Karatsu, who was a municipal systems library director and also the interim director at Pasadena. He said a rule of thumb is about 25% of a first year salary. I did find out that Palos Verdes spent about $24,500 on their search, which is it's actually their costs were a little less than that rule of thumb, but that seems to be at least a figure that is usable to sort of estimate what it might cost us. We do feel as a committee that we want to include input from key stakeholders in the life of the library, especially given our own history, and especially both staff and public input have been gathered in different kinds of ways. In Palos Verdes, they had the search firm met with the staff without anybody from the board present, not to interview candidates in that case, but to have a discussion with the staff on the kinds of characteristics that they were hoping for in a director. Cindy told me about a model in Glendale where after finalists were identified through the initial part of the search process, then there were several sets of interview committees of different stakeholder groups. So one interview group that was members of the public, one interview group that was certain members of staff, and one interview group that were peers of a potential library director, in other words, other library directors from the area. And there was a scoring system and a way for different groups to weigh in on their opinion of the various finalists. Another idea that Terry had was that perhaps there could be some sort of cross committee assistance in that since our strategic planning committee is already scheduling public meetings that include members of the public, that some ways of gathering input, again, this isn't at the interview stage, but ways of gathering input from the public members of your committee about what they might be looking for in a new director could be done. At the same time, Cindy's plan to have a staff retreat, while we wouldn't want to cut into all the plans for that day, there may be a way to take advantage of the fact that the staff will be gathered and some input could be gathered that way. Finally, as far as best practices are concerned, overwhelmingly everybody that I talked to emphasized the importance that at least the initial part of the process be tightly confidential, because potential candidates who don't want their employers to know that they might be looking for another position have to have assurances that their application process is confidential. I kind of heard varying things about the need for confidentiality toward the end of the process, from one end of the spectrum to the other, meaning from the end of the spectrum of you don't breathe a word until the person's been, had an offer and accepted it, all the way to, you have a meeting with all of the finalists. This wasn't recommended, by the way, but a meeting with all of the finalists with an audience of people that could question them at the end, and the idea that finalists in a search like this may not necessarily expect complete confidentiality all the way through to the very end of the process, that by the time somebody is a finalist, they may just expect that their name might become known. So at this point, this committee recommends that the board authorize the committee and the staff to work together to write an RFP and to distribute it for the selection of an executive search firm. Some of the evaluation criteria that were suggested to me in the various conversations that I had were, of course, fees, openness to community input and ideas about how to gather that, how to publicize the opening, examples of recent hires, references from recent clients, along with any other criteria that trustees might ask us to consider. I've, again, coming from the various conversations that I had, some of the rationale for the advantage to using a search firm as opposed to doing it ourselves is that we could expect to end up with a larger pool of applicants from a wider geographical range. I think given our history, anybody who Googles us is going to kind of wonder what kind of employer we might be, and to have a professional search firm assisting us with the process would probably give a higher level of confidence to people who might apply. Applicants can be informally vetted through the networks of a search firm, who have a lot of contacts, who know a lot of different people in this field, so that might give us some additional insight as to the qualifications of people who apply. Of course, expert guidance, because neither Terry nor I are HR professionals. We may be able to do it in a more efficient time frame. Again, involving, people in the HR profession would assure that our process is legal and equitable, and given all of the different pressures on our budget, I just feel like the investment to make sure that we hire the very best possible director is one of the very best investments that we can make. So at this point, we recommend that the actual search committee remains to be Terry and myself, but that if the board does decide to go ahead and hire a search firm, that we will continue to explore with them the best ways to solicit public and staff input as our process moves forward, and that we would report back to the board for approval any of plans that might come out of those discussions. Any questions for me?
So, I'm just thinking ahead to like our time constraints we're under, right? And I fully support hiring a firm. I think considering what you just said on our recent history, it's going to be hard enough to recruit, and then to try and do it on our own. I feel like we'd end up in a situation where we have nobody in 6 months from now. But I also, as far as process, instead of us just approving the RFP and having to come back in a month and approve the person, like, I want to throw out there the idea of the board tonight simply approving the committee to not only put out the RFP, but to be able to make the decision on the firm up to some financial cap. I mean, I'm personally comfortable with the committee meeting consultation with the other folks that sit on it, other than the board members making that decision, versus having to come back a month from now, vote on that firm before they can even begin their work. I just get thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I think that it'd be great to move the process as quickly as possible, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is that, like, this is going to be an expensive contract. So I would like to have at least a public discussion of that, and I think it's really important that we give members of the public an opportunity to comment on that, to see who the candidates are, to make their own commentary, to give their own feedback.
So you're talking about the candidates for the search firm?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
whoever the respondents to the RFP are, I think we have to allow for public comment on that. As much as it delays the efficiency of the process, I think that's also just our responsibility as a public agency. The other thing that, kind of, Betsy, you alluded to this a little bit, is the potential crossover, right, between somebody facilitating the executive search process and somebody facilitating a strategic planning process. And, I talked to a number of people as well who kind of saw those as very closely linked. And I wonder if, because there are some places that do both, right, that do both strategic planning and search. And there is this argument to be made that as part of a visioning process, we're figuring out what we want in a director and what we want in a library district, that those two things are very closely intertwined. And it may be worth thinking about ways in which those can be unified rather than separated. And I don't know what the right answer is to that. I don't know what, you know, the options are, whether any of the search firms who kind of do this for library people exclusively have that capability. I know some of the strategic planning people I talked to said they did. The extent to which they're competent in library matters, you know, we would need to do an RFP to discuss, but I don't know, it seems like there are a lot of conversations to be had about sort of future directions and seeing if we could get those to cohere a little bit. Seems like it has a lot of value.
So is one thing you're envisioning whether one firm could do both a search and a, okay, so I have, maybe Cindy, do you happen to know, because you gave me some ideas, and I also got from these different contacts ideas of different firms to use. I have no idea if they are exclusively.
I haven't had that experience. I don't know. I mean, the firms I know are solely the HR recruiting, executive search especially.
Yeah, I have not heard of that kind of hybrid organization, and I unless we found out that it was someone who's, you know, as competent in HR recruiting as any of the ones who are standalone HR firms. I'm not sure that I would want to dilute our search effort by trying to make it do too much under one company. So
no, that makes sense.
I'm like Jason in that I worry a little bit about the speed at which this needs to proceed. And you hear all kinds of estimates from people about, oh, it's going to take you a year, or it's going to take 6 months, or all these different points of view on it. I do think it's going to take a while. And I think that everything that we do, because Cindy's tenure here has a shelf life, unfortunately, having to do with the number of hours that she can work for the fiscal years going forward. I think everything that we do should really be geared for speedy moves on our part to get this on the ground and running with it. When we talked about the idea of the crossover with the group that you formed, a very impressive one, by the way, would be simply that if they could comment on a card or in a closed session or whatever it might be about what characteristics they're looking for in a library director, and really feel like they've got some input that we can take, listen to, and get in front of a search firm, I think that would be the most streamlined way to do things. And I think that aligns with what you're talking about too.
That's what that came from me. As far as time frame is concerned, another thought that I got from more than one source of these different folks that I spoke to was to be cautious as you go through your process when you get to the end of it if you really have not found the right person. And the caution is, don't settle.
Yeah.
So, you know, as even as swift and efficient as we think we might be to, you know, reach a finish line, you know, we also have to factor in the possibility that we might get all the way to that finish line and we might have to redo some of our process. So I think it's going to be long for the reasons we've already alluded to and know about, but there's no guarantee that at the end of whatever process we set out on now, that we're going to come to the end of it and not have that turn out to be the first stage. So that's just a caution I heard more than once. So I guess there are two ways to go. One is to authorize us to, well, let's be realistic, to authorize us to create an RFP, distribute it, have a deadline of however long we think it's going to take people to prepare one, and give us responses. Honestly, that's probably, I'm thinking, all that could reasonably be done between now and the next meeting. The idea that we could do all of that and Terry and I interview and select someone, which I think was kind of what you were thinking could happen, Jason, before the March meeting, I think is probably...
I wasn't necessarily suggesting before the March meeting. My idea would be to craft something in a way that it wouldn't have to come back before the board necessarily. I obviously, we don't wanna rush things, I'm more concerned with, my personal thing is, I'm more concerned with the public input, the staff input. Once we're to the point where we have candidates to think about, than so much what firm we use. And that's my personal thing, that's why I made the suggestion. I'm not so concerned about it that I'm gonna force a vote on it, but that's my thought is, yeah, I'm more concerned with the process once we have a firm in place, than the process to get a firm.
The amount that you're considering would require it to come back to the full board anyway, so.
You can say up to some amount, that's our rule, if it comes in under, it comes in under.
I mean, I don't know specifically, I'm not super versed in the laws of RFPs, but typically they are designed to make that somewhat public.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at your procurement policy, I don't have them, I mean, I think your authority is for $10,000 to the director. Above that, I think it needs to come back for a vote.
If we were, but I think part of the idea, not only for this committee, but for others, the whole reason that we put the mid-year budget adjustment after this part of the agenda was to possibly have the ability to put money into that line item that I don't know if putting it there means that we're also approving the spending of it, maybe that's a separate thing. But if we had a cap, then would we also need approval after the figure had been approved of in the budget adjustment?
So putting the budget in there is one thing, but then approving the contract is really the second item. And so, just to offer the suggestion that was made to maybe go out and try and procure that such that the committee can bring back a recommended person by the next meeting, might move that along. Right? I mean, these RFP processes can be very elaborate, they can be relatively simple. Right? And if you have a defined universe of firms who you're already speaking with, there could be, that you shortlist and ask, 3 firms to propose on it. You can also put it out to the world. I mean, that's,
So it's an idea for discussion, not emotions. Let me just put that out there.
Let me just say,
I don't know if I can comment.
No, I'm sorry, we closed the comments, yeah, there's no comments from the floor now, I'm sorry.
just as a point of information, I do have the RFP that Pellsworthy's used, so we have a, relatively a good model, I think, to be able to produce an RFP fairly quickly, I hope. So I guess the part what I'm going to ask for is the board's action to approve Terry and I and staff writing and issuing an RFP. And with the idea that we'll come back to the March meeting with the recommendation of whom to hire. I don't know if that necessitates us doing this mid-year budget adjustment for this particular line item now, or if that can just wait till March when we know how much it's going to cost.
Well, why don't we put a figure, some sort of a cap on that, so that, well, because it could be that you have up to $50,000, and I mean, so why not put a cap on that amount at $30,000 or something like that, $25,000, so that you have some means of operating in, and it's just not just getting anybody out there. I don't know.
Well, that would give us, you give us a figure, or we decide on a figure, and that would give us one really good criteria for selection. So.
Maybe we shouldn't. I don't know.
So I think your projection estimate of somewhere between 25 and 30 makes a ton of sense. I think we can look at what the line item for consulting entails when we get back to 4A, And certainly there's that option to keep the 25 that's in there now and just leave it alone, and that would cover it. And, you know, if we need to readjust something in April or whatever, we can always make that decision. I think that your proposed timeline as well of like, let's get the RFP out and come back at the March meeting with, you know, ideally some recommended firms or some people who have competed for that bid. I think you're right, like I don't think it can move that much quicker. So that seems to satisfy both ideas of keeping the budget firmly in mind and keeping efficiency rolling along as quickly as possible. So I would move that we authorize the committee to do exactly that, to issue the RFP and to come back with whatever bids and a recommendation at the March meeting. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, then I move that.
And I'll second that.
Okay.
Okay. Moved and seconded, and all in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion carries.
Thank you.
Next up is the Facilities Committee. And that's Jason.
All right, moving along. Everybody else had to show me up with these nice pre-typed up reports, and I'm all proud of myself for having notes to give verbal reports. So we'll work on that for next time.
That's good.
All right. So yes, so we had our first ad hoc facilities committee meeting on February 20th. Myself, Terry, Cindy, Stella, and our wonderful facilities manager all attended. So I'll just kind of give some reports as to the different, what we discussed. We touched on some of it obviously earlier, but just thinking about you know, the current budgeted allotment, and I think this has been historical, is about $250,000. You know, the staff have been looking at the roof and the need to replace that, but considering that best estimates to do so came in at somewhere around $300,000, obviously that's not something that can be done within the current budget structure. And then also keeping in mind that, you know, when we voted and approved the creation of the committee, it was really done under the purview of thinking how it aligns with the need for a new strategic plan. So then obviously our discussion centered around, you know, thinking about that, really what are our priorities at this time and what can we do within our current budget. So what the committee was looking at were, as far as current priorities that we could start working on, obviously one of the biggest concerns that's been addressed and discussed and brought up even before this current board is the ADA compliance here at the main branch and at the Bob Lucas branch. And then I would say the second issue is you know, the need to invest some additional funds in the Bob Lucas branch itself. So on the ADA, and you know, folks may remember there was a presentation given on this, I think sometime last summer, but just to kind of remind folks, you know, we're looking at somewhere in the tune of about $500,000 for the already identified issues here at the main branch. And then, you know, within that same report, if you look at all of the potential items that have been identified for the Bob Lucas branch, you're looking at just under $400,000. So obviously we need to have a plan in place on how to address those. It's not something that we can simply approve. So what I would propose that we do tonight is two things. One, you know, I think we need to put out 2 RFPs for the design work. You know, some of this identification was done, you know, nearly a year ago, so obviously we need current cost estimates at the very least. And then I know in particular, you know, ADA issues, that law is always changing, so I, you know, again, I think we need to do an RFP based upon current law, current costs, you know, what are we really looking at? So, what the thought of the committee is to do an RFP for both the design work and architecture for all of the ADA compliance issues for here at the main branch. And the second issue would be to put out an RFP for the complete refurbishment, including ADA compliance and space planning for the Bob Lucas branch. So I'll stop there for questions, comments, feedback.
Okay, so two RFPs, one basically for a full update for Bob Lucas, right? So deferred maintenance, ADA, space plan, like everything that needs to be done at Bob Lucas is one RFP, correct?
Correct.
And then the other one is all ADA main branch stuff.
Correct. And then I think the other thing that we wanted to consider with the ADA compliance issues here at the main branch, you know, obviously we think we're looking at least $500,000. Not something that, at least within the budget, we could take on all at once. So I think we wanted to specify within the RFP to ask the firm to put something together that would allow us to think about phases, right? So, you know, thinking about long-term strategic plan, you know, are there options to take that avenue as well?
Okay. So I guess my question is this, so when we heard the facilities report that John, you presented, whenever that, in March or June, or, anyway, when you did that, there were sort of a couple of categories, right? There was ADA stuff, there's deferred maintenance stuff, and then there's just ongoing upkeep stuff. Is it the case that you guys have triaged all of that and you've decided the ADA stuff is the most critical and needs to happen first, and that's why the suggestion to do these RFPs is what it is? Or can you help me understand like what your thinking is on that?
I mean, others can kick in. I know from my perspective, and part of the discussion is that ADA is a huge priority. Besides the fact that it's the right thing to do, there's, you know, significant legal liability for us to know that this problem exists and not be actively trying to correct it. So I'll let the others.
Well, yeah, yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. I mean, we've already had people in the public kind of call us on a couple things. And, you know, we all know that the entrance is not satisfactory at all. So, you know, if we were to spend a small amount of money to get a plan in place, and money that we think we have already in this budget, then we can take it, and at that point we say, okay, out of that, what are we going to be able to fund, and what can we do above and beyond that? I mean, we need a roof. There's no doubt we need a roof. Everything in the report, and Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, nothing needs to be done tomorrow. I mean, it's all graded 1 through whatever, and nothing has a 1, which would mean it really is about to fall apart. So we can defer some things, but it really is, like Jason said, it really is a matter of the legal side of it. You know, somebody's going to call us on something at some point, and what's right.
Right. Yeah, so my question is not in any way designed to say we shouldn't deal with our ADA non-compliance issues immediately, like we should have dealt with them a long time ago. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, you know, there's been a, like, I don't know how, like almost a 20-year history of deferring maintenance in this district, and I guess I'm trying to figure out what we're kicking the can down the road on now that might result in higher costs later so that we can plan for it, right? Because for whatever we're gonna do on this, I guess my concern is not so much the order of the projects or the estimate from the architect or a sense of how to space plan, but a sense of how we're gonna pay for it. And whether that's gonna necessitate a bonding issue or, you know, a substantially larger effort in our next parcel tax renewal or some other kind, we cannot cover this from reserves.
No.
Like it's not possible. So I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, do you have any idea at this point, and I know it's very early in the process, of what we might be looking at in terms of how to pay for this, where it's gonna come from, how triaging things in this way will impact that financial planning. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I don't have an answer in terms of financing it. I mean, I do think that one of the things we talked about in the committee was looking to the strategic planning process to kind of help us prioritize beyond the immediate, which is, you know, the ADA assessment. And, you know, I don't have it in front of me in terms of all the things that are included in that report, and it goes way beyond 1.5 million if you take it all into consideration. So, I mean, we could come back next month and go over more detail in terms of, I mean, that was my concern, because on that facilities report, it was like a lot of different items, but it wasn't really prioritized as units. You know, so if, for instance, if you do a roof, there are a whole lot of other things you gotta do if you're gonna do a roof, like a skylight and getting rid of equipment that's not working and all of that. So I haven't had enough time to really assess that, to be able to come to you and say, you know, you should do this, that, and the other.
So do you think that, and this is again a question of, I guess, sort of responsibilities, is it the plan of you, Cindy, as the director, or is that something that's gonna be more the job of the facilities committee to come up with basically a prioritized project list and a sense of like, okay, when we do the roof, we need to do HVAC, or when we redo, you know, Bob Lucas, it makes more sense to redo, you know, this and that and the other thing, rather than coming back in for subsequent processes. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
is that gonna be something that you handle as the director, or is that gonna be something that is handled by the facilities committee?
I mean, I think I should do it in partnership with the facilities committee.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about that. I mean, you know, brand new board member came in like, this committee's gonna put together a whole big strategic plan and we'll take it to the, I think, these two items that I'm recommending, if we approve the RFPs and get a current cost estimate and all that, I think the discussion within the committee is, the money is there in the reserves to cover these two things. Frankly, more than that is in the reserves, so that is something the board could consider in the future. I think we can't even talk about the rest of it, you know, without having a strategic plan on how to pay for it. And so I think the discussion within the committee is we should move forward on these RFPs, and then the future work of the committee will absolutely be, you know, starting to think about the other list and ideas to, you know, bring back to the board on how do we start packaging those together and thinking about those costs, and then a multi-year plan about how we're going to pay for it.
And there would be another, I might suggest another way in terms of the RFP, because the facilities assessment for Bob Lucas we have, what we talked about in the committee was the space planning, and that's not what's done. I mean, it's more interior design than it is architectural study. So we could combine it into one RFP, because there are plenty of firms that do space planning and architectural design, and save us some money.
How about we do that? Unless there's a good reason not to. It would seem to me to make sense to engage one firm to look at our space needs across the board. Also because, you know, we don't want to duplicate things at Bob Lucas that we can do at the Main, and vice versa. So having somebody who understands like the full context of the district seems to me to make sense.
So just combining it into a single RFP. Yeah, that's.
My takeaway from that meeting was a little bit different, and I thought that the plan was that we would try to find a way to sequester some money that would allow us to take the first step, which was a space planning / architectural review of most of the Bob Lucas branches. What I took away, I think there was some spillover to the Main branch as well, but with the idea that you could attack that project because it was semi-affordable. And remember that we're managing at a deficit here until the end of June. Then we start with a whole new budget that has a whole new, presumably, $250,000 in there for building, you know, facilities and so on. There also may be some money, I'm a little hazy on this, for the Friends of the Library. They've got some money set aside for repairs and improvements at Bob Lucas. Have you heard about this too, Katie? Yeah. So I think there's sources of money out there, and I think this thing becomes a lot more affordable after our fiscal year ends, right? And it's a project that you can attack now with ADA improvements, it's high visibility for a community that really wants it. It's a great step forward for the library. So the initial steps that we talked about, okay, let's get this money, you know, $50,000 or $1,000, you thought something like that, to get this architectural and space planning thing going, along with the ADA compliance part of it. And then, as long as we don't let it just go fallow, the way that we did with our facility assessment that was done back last April, it's already almost a year old, you can start really making progress with this thing as you roll over into the new budget and as you explore other sources of money for this. It's not a big project in terms of price. It's like $380,000 or something like that. It was what the price tag was. I might be wrong about that. So maybe even less than that. This is Bob Lucas only. So that was kind of what I took away from the meeting. Just want to give you my 2 cents there.
I think we're saying the same thing. I may have just used way too many words. So yeah, so what I'm saying is the board vote tonight to approve the director to put out the RFP for the design process.
Right, with an approval to spend that amount of money, right? The $50,000 that we talked about, that we've got in the budget. Jason, you're looking quizzical now, so I didn't know if I
We
got that
think we
wrong.
can do both.
Well, I don't know, I mean, like I said in the committee, I think if you approve going forward, then I will start consulting with a couple people that I know and who have architecture or work for architectural firms and get a better sense of it, but I mean, just from past experience, I'd say 50,000 is a good estimate.
Because we did talk about, I mean, this is similar discussion to the one we just had, right? I mean, we did talk about in the committee about like what we could expect as far as timelines for the RFPs to go out and then get responses and see where those fall for the board to approve a specific firm. I think obviously if we could find a firm that could do both things and that's a reasonable amount of money, we should absolutely do that. If we put out the RFPs and it makes more sense to do 2 different firms, then we do that. But I think so I think we're talking the same
I
thing.
think we're saying the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, we're approving to be, essentially begin the RFP process and for the director to bring back the best options to the board for approval as soon as possible.
That sounds like a motion to me.
Do I need to restate that, Caitlin, or? Okay. So, I would make a motion that the board approve giving the library director the authority to put out requests for proposal for the refurbishment and space planning for the Bob Lucas branch, including ADA compliance, as well as ADA compliance for the main branch, and to come back to the board the earliest possible meeting with suggested firms for the board to vote on.
I second that.
All right, moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye and raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Finally, to Strategic Planning Committee. Katie, your report, please.
Absolutely. So there's a whole long report that you guys are welcome to read, and it's in the packet. There is also an updated version of that that includes all the members of the public who I'm going to recommend that we approve for this committee, because the deadline was the Friday before this meeting. We had to wait for everybody's stuff to come in, so that's why there's an updated version. So basically the long and the short of it is this month's work was largely organizational. There were a couple of things that we focused on. One was soliciting submissions from members of the public to join this committee. I am very pleased to say that we have an outstanding slate of people to recommend for the board's approval, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The second thing that we did was looking at sort of an organizational approach, and I reached out to CSDA and talked to a couple other folks from different library districts, and one thing that was recommended generally was the value of having a facilitator, especially one with special district experience, help us with the strategic planning process. And so I want to talk about that a little bit with you guys and kind of get some feedback from you. There were two firms that I reached out to, both of which are preferred vendors from CSDA, both of which are recommended by a couple of different folks. And they have largely similar processes. And the idea is that you hire a firm and they come in and they do sort of a fact-finding, not technically an audit, but basically an overview of what's going on. They would do interviews with all of us, with staff, with members of the public, certainly everybody who's on the committee, as well as any other key stakeholders that we identify and we say, we'd like you to get their input. And then from that, they kind of put together a report. Everybody's interviews are confidential. There's no, this person said that. But it's an overview of the district as it stands right now and what needs and sort of what gaps and white spaces they see to exist. There's then a process that unfolds, you can think of it as a series of basically workshops. And everybody I talked to emphasized how important it was to have the entire board participate in this part of the process, especially because the entire board is going to be tasked with executing on whatever comes out of it. So it's something that we want to make sure all of us are really invested in. And the idea is that we go through, a couple of days of, sort of long sessions with all of us, with members of the public who are on the committee, and we have a really big picture discussion of what do we want the district to be, what kind of library district do we want to have, what do we want that to look like going forward. This is one of the places where there was some thought that overlap with the executive search process may be helpful. So in the sense of as part of that process, maybe one of the questions we ask is, what would an ideal library director look like? And that could then be passed on, to an executive search firm or to whoever, the appropriate person would be. At that point, once we have sort of a list of, these are all the things we want to do, these are all the dreams we want to accomplish, then that set of goals, objectives, mission, vision, whatever, gets handed to staff and to the interim director to take a look at it and assess it for realism. And to say, okay, here's how realistic these things are, here's sort of an implementation plan, if this is what you want to do, this is how long it would take. They bring that back to the committee / the full board, and we kind of reorder and reorganize. And then at the end of all of that, we have a pretty actionable plan with a set of steps and a sense of, kind of ideally buy-in across the board. So that's roughly the process that was outlined to me. And I'm going to recommend that we seriously consider hiring somebody to help us with this for a couple of reasons. One is I think it will be helpful to have a third-party assessment of the district and its needs. I think that all of us are very invested, obviously, and everybody in the community is very invested, staff are very invested, but I think having some objectivity on that, especially from sort of a governance and planning perspective, would be really helpful. Secondly, I think it will help us stay on track, stay streamlined, stay organized, and really get the best out of everybody's time, whether it's members of the public who are volunteering to serve on this committee, or whether it's staff, or whether it's the board. Really making sure that we use everybody's time wisely and that we're letting, somebody who's done this a lot of times guide that process, I think would be helpful. And finally, I think it would be helpful to have an ongoing relationship with a firm that we could then go back to in 2 years and say, okay, here's where we are. Let's sort of, reimagine parts of this, and we don't have to start the whole thing over from scratch. We can, kind of move on from there. So for a lot of reasons, I think that bringing on board a facilitator to do this would be very helpful. The price range that I've heard from folks is pretty consistent. It's, again, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 start to finish, depending on how much stuff you need. And so I think as a general ballpark range, that's pretty reasonable. with the idea being that, you know, because we're in a little bit of an unusual position where you don't have a permanent director, some of this would either, you know, we would put on hold or we would revisit once we have somebody on board, so that they're also part of our strategic planning process, and are involved in the development of those ideas. So really the two recommendations that I'm going to make tonight that we move forward on is, one, that we approve the slate of members of the public that are in your packet, which represent all the library support groups, a lot of really important organizations and groups across Altadena, and I think a pretty diverse cross-section of our neighbors. So I'm gonna recommend that we approve that, and I'm also gonna request that we approve an RFP process for a strategic planning facilitator.
Could I just jump in here for the math part of this? So we've got 25,000, 50,000, 25,000. So we've got $100,000 that we want to spend tonight on these things. And before we, you know, go crazy, I'd like to hear from Nicole that, okay, we've got money sort of sequestered away in line items that don't cause us to have to alter the drawdown on our reserves.
It will alter the money that we do pull in from reserves. We did move 50,000 from capital to architecture, so that's covered. That process will be covered. I did pull 25 out of consultant, so I can add that 25 back, which would bring us back to our original figure of 75. But if we add the other 25 for strategic planning, that puts us at 100,000 for consultants, line 7155, which changes the amount we pull from reserves from 213,000 to 253.
Boy, that's pretty, you must have been good in math at school, 'cause that was pretty quick. So we went from 200 and what? 213?
213 to 253. 263, I'm sorry.
There are still opportunities for savings in there if we don't.
Come in under budget.
I mean, we've got the BK bill, we talked about that, that's for the $50,000, we managed that well, then we're picking up money there and so on. So I just, you know, I'll throw that out there for the board to consider. We should have done that in fairness to Katie way before we passed motions to do all this other stuff.
So give me those numbers again and where you take the line items from.
Of course. So we had budgeted 50,000 into architectural and engineering. That's line 7140, and we took that out of capital.
And you took it out of capital, okay.
And then I had removed $25,000 from line 7155.
7155.
So if I add the 25 back for an executive search and then another 25 on top of it for strategic planning, that brings that line item to $100,000.
7155, really?
Which makes us over budget by 263,000 instead of the 213.
Now, for what it's worth, the initial mid-year review that we looked at was worse than this. It was 301 or 314, I can't remember.
Yes, that was before we looked at the extra revenue that came in from the county.
Right.
And we're expecting another property tax installment before the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah. So this really doesn't feel like too much of a stretch for me but I want everybody to be informed before we do all this stuff.
How
Would you
much
agree with
was
that,
that?
Nicole?
I would.
I just have a couple of questions for Katie, but I don't want to jump if you guys are still discussing the
I'm done.
thing. Okay.
I'll have one, but go ahead.
Okay, so I didn't see any staff on the proposed members. Is that something that you're considering at a later?
I'm gonna pass that over to Cindy.
Yeah, more staff will be involved. I mean, obviously I'm on there, but I wanted to get through my one-on-ones with staff to get a better sense of what everybody is doing and deciding who is most appropriately placed on this.
Other question is, your selection of a firm going to be decided by your full strategic planning committee?
No, that'd be decided by the board.
Well, sorry, recommendation for, is the strategic planning committee going to look at the firms and then make a recommendation? And the reason I ask is, I know there are firms that specialize in library-specific strategic planning, and then the special district, which it looks like you looked at the special district
Yeah.
strategic planning firms, so I didn't know if that was still, I didn't know if you had made your decision already, and that
No,
that's
I
what you were
haven't.
considering, or if you were still looking at that, if that was something your committee was gonna be.
Right, I haven't made a decision, and I think what would be most appropriate, and Cindy, please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think what would be most appropriate is for the director to put together an RFP and bring back a recommendation, because I think that's a much better way to go forward than to have myself or a committee, a bunch of people again. Because we need, I think you're right, like, we need somebody who has strategic planning experience, library experience, special district experience, government, like, all of these things are important. And so I would feel much more comfortable asking the director to handle that, and then bring back a recommendation once we get some responses on that RFP.
Okay, now that makes sense. So what you're asking for is basically what Jason's
It's the
asking
same.
for.
Mhm, that's right.
So I think this calls for a motion, Katie, for your.
Yeah, so I'm gonna separate them. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna just ask the same question, because I would, it's okay. I would just have the same concern that a strategic planning facilitator at least have some experience with library strategic planning. Yeah, so.
Great. Okay, then I'm gonna make the first motion, which is that I move that the board approve the slate of committee members as presented in your updated packet, and I'm gonna read them into the record, just for the sake of making sure I get it right. So, those proposed members being Cindy Cleary, interim director. Granny, I'm gonna say, how do you pronounce your first name? There you go, Hafsa Abdul Shakur. Ann Cohen, Veronica Jones, Sharon Collins, Monica Hubbard, Sherry King, Juanita Gutierrez, and Cynthia Carmona, all of whose qualifications can be found in your packet.
Second.
No, I was just gonna say, should we add to that and Cindy Cleary plus her delegates? I mean, it's a minor point, but.
Yeah, sure. So Cindy Cleary plus any staff she designates.
Did you move that, or did you?
Yeah,
Was that a motion?
I'm making a motion, yeah.
I will
That's
second.
an issue.
All right, so that has been moved and seconded. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
And then I'll make a second motion that we ask the director to begin an RFP process for a strategic planning facilitator. And that she come back to the board with some recommendations as soon as that's possible.
Oh, I'll second it. Getting kind of
Okay,
tired.
it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Everything else, is that it for the motions?
That's it.
Okay, okay. All right. We are on now to the vote on the mid-year review on approving that. And now I guess it would be with those items that we put in. I'm told that I can't make those motions without vacating the chair, so I'll wait for someone else to do that.
So can we just, I'm sorry, I know it's late and it's been a long night. Can we just quickly run through the adjustments that we're gonna make to the budget adjustment?
Adjustments to the adjustments.
Exactly.
Okay, so, really the only adjustment that we're going to make is we're going to change line 7155, consultants other, from a revised budget figure of 50,000 to 100,000.
Are we gonna adjust the revenue number for, that Mark mentioned? They said there was a $5,000,
The foundation
or
figure.
excuse me, the foundation number. Are we gonna adjust that from 10 to 5, or are we gonna leave it at 10?
So they've already contributed 5. We're anticipating another 5 to bring the total to 10. That
Right.
figure. It's there for us. We just have to request it. So we're able to use it as revenue.
Oh, okay,
if we
maybe I
choose to use
misunderstood. I
it.
thought he said that it was there until December, so it might be on next year's.
They run on a calendar year
Right.
instead of a fiscal, but it is available to us when we decide to request it. So he did
Okay.
say if we want it before the end of this fiscal year, we're welcome to
Okay,
make that request.
great, perfect, thank you.
Did we do an adjustment to 71, what is that, 7140 architectural and engineering? Did we do something there?
That was part of the original mid-year that I presented. So we took that from capital and moved it to architectural. I'm not changing it anymore though.
Okay, so that is 50, okay.
So do we have a motion to approve that mid-year budget?
So moved. I'll second that.
All right, been moved and seconded. All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
There's one final, actually, there's the trustee reports followed by California CSDA correspondence. And the trustee reports, I guess we can start with those. We just go, I mean, usually they're done just orally, and we want to start with you, Jason?
Sure, so I'll be quick since it's 8:45. Just want to give a quick report back, having attended the ALA midwinter meeting. I know Stella's provided a report, I think previously on this. So the main thing to report back is frankly, the theme of the conference was around the modern library and everything that modern libraries are facing. So some of the seminars I attended included Libraries Transform Social Innovation, meeting patrons where they are, public libraries and healthy communities, build awareness, drive engagement, measure impact, improving library community engagement strategies. So obviously brought a lot back from that, and looking forward to using all of that in my participation on the board, but also the subcommittees around strategic planning and facilities.
So I've got a report in the packet. I'm not going to go through it. It's long, and if you want to read it, you can. But I am going to say one thing that came out of some CSDA board member best practices training that I'd like to suggest to the board and see how you guys feel about it, which is basically it's impossible for us to look at each other. And I would really like to be able to see, like, Gwen is down at the end and I can never see you. And I feel like if I look at you guys, then I'm boxing out Jason here. So it would be nice if we could try a new room setup where we can all see each other and like have sort of a more collaborative feel. What? Yeah, we could do like a U, yeah, whatever, I don't know, but just something where we can all see each other, I think would be really nice.
Jonathan and I actually talked about this before you came in, and we were going to surprise you with the tables already done. But Kylie recommended that we wait and discuss it, so I'm glad you brought that up.
I would have achieved that.
I certainly hope we don't have to make a motion on this.
No, we don't, we don't, it's just an idea, so.
I propose a resolution.
Oh, good, yeah, we'll write one.
Well, Jonathan,
Right.
he says it can be done, so we
Okay.
can do that next meeting.
Great, fantastic,
Resolution.
cool. Thanks, that's everything.
Gwen, why don't you go next?
I have no report.
Betsy?
I don't either. I spent my whole month on search.
Okay, I'm told I need to mention a couple things in my report, and that is I will be on vacation, so I won't be at the next meeting, the March meeting. Just a shout out to everybody that attended the Chamber of Commerce Center we had. Seems like more than a month ago that happened, but it wasn't. That was very valuable, and I think it was a good experience for all. We made some good connections there as well, maybe even towards some foundation money, which was very heartening. And then I did, in terms of my little educational piece, I took a webinar on different ways to fund library improvements, which is very interesting, and I got some ideas there. And then finally, I am as trying to be an ambassador to the library all the time, I am scheduled to speak at Montecedro to their group on April the 19th about the Altadena Library in which they can get involved in. So, next final thing here is the California Special Districts Association correspondence.
It's really just informational. You guys can look at it. Typically letters, to the district, to the board, grant award letters, things like that would go in the board package. So that's just there because we received it.
Basically, CSDA also has board members, and so they sent out a letter saying that they were having seats that were going to be up, and if our board wanted to nominate one of you guys to go be on the CSDA board, that was basically the gist of that. So it's there for you guys to read.
One board at a time.
Yeah, one board at a time.
I should say.
Yeah, I was no way suggesting that you guys go jump on that board, it's just information.
All right, are there any proposed future agenda items from the board? Is that covered? All right then, can we get a
Can I make some comments real fast? It says you can make comments at the end.
Okay, yeah, well, I guess so,
Two
okay, sure,
comments.
yeah.
First comment, if you're gonna be gone and they need to take a vote, are you gonna be on the phone like you were when you were gone?
I won't be able to.
Well, then bring me a newspaper. And the second comment is, I really want you guys to think about the street in front of the library. Because that was how I first got involved with coming to all these meetings. Is because the way it is, I can't come in the front entrance because the way the street goes down, if I open my door, it closes before I can get out. So originally, I went to the previous director. She told me to go to town council. I went to town council. They directed me back to the previous director. So it's been going back and forth for the last 3 or 4 years.
So you're talking about coming in from Mariposa?
From Mariposa.
Yeah. So
And
that,
at one point, they talked about just head-in parking, just in front of the library. I don't know what happened. But different people have emailed me, and because I have brought this up so many times and asked me what happened, I wish you guys would really look into it, because a lot of people that have issues with walking or walking with canes can't get in, because climbing up the stairs just to come to this meeting is killing me.
so completely agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy, but it's my understanding, and it was my intent with the approval for the RFP on the ADA accessibility tonight, that is included in that. So that when we get that back, that will be part of the directive, and that all inclusive is that issue will be included in.
I appreciate that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay then, can I get a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion.
I move. Second.
Okay, moved and seconded, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
So we adjourn at 9:55.